What if power didn't make people wiser, just weirder? Behind every jeweled crown is a story too ridiculous to invent. Mad kings who thought they were made of glass, queens who ruled from gymnasiums, emperors who patented rain. This isn't history as it's taught. It's history as it truly was. Unhinged, unfiltered, and absolutely regal. These are the bizarre, the absurd, the scandalous footnotes that textbooks tried to skip. Welcome to 99 ridiculous facts about kings and queens in history, because nothing says divine right like putting your horse in charge of Rome. Before we dive headfirst into royal madness, take a second to hit that subscribe button, unless you're already royalty, in which case, carry on. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Madrid? Sunrise in Seoul? Let's see how far this royal rabbit hole reaches. King George III of Great Britain, known for his madness, likely suffered from porphyria, a genetic blood disorder that caused his strange behavior and hallucinations. Imagine ruling the largest empire on earth while quietly unraveling from the inside out. King George III didn't just lose the American colonies, he lost his grip on reality. His letters became torrents of manic prose, his voice flitted between divine commands and terrified whispers, and he often had to be restrained from stripping naked in public. Naturally, everyone assumed he was cursed, bewitched, or simply insane. The idea that a king could be ill medically, genetically, tragically was too modern a thought for 18th century minds marinated in humors and superstition. The likely culprit? Porphyria, a disorder that turns your blood toxic, your skin sensitive to sunlight, and your brain into a kaleidoscope of pain and delusion. But royal blood comes with royal denials. Doctors leeched and starved him, treating his condition the way one might fix a broken clock with a hammer and prayer. None of it worked. And yet, George wasn't ousted. Because madness, in monarchy, wasn't disqualifying it, was just Wednesday. His reign limped forward, while his mind sprinted in circles. A broken man on a throne made of denial. And speaking of thrones seized in denial next, we meet a woman who took one by force, with enlightenment in one hand and betrayal in the other. Catherine the Great of Russia was a German princess who overthrew her husband, Peter III, to seize the throne. She also had an impressive library and was a patron of the arts. You might think a German teenager named Sophie becoming Empress of Russia sounds improbable, and it was until she decided it wasn't. Catherine, as she later renamed herself, didn't simply marry into power, surgically removed the obstacle sleeping next to her. Peter III, her cousin husband, played with toy soldiers, idolized Frederick the Great, and alienated the Russian nobility with the precision of a man born to be overthrown. Catherine orchestrated a textbook coup with the army's backing, declared herself empress, and possibly had Peter killed. Depends on which version of the bedtime story you prefer. What followed was one of the most contradictory reigns in imperial history. A ruthless autocrat who read Voltaire, a despot who championed education, a woman blamed for everything from political backstabbing to horse-related rumors, but who mostly just wanted to modernize Russia and be taken seriously. And when she wasn't rewriting laws or expanding the empire, she was reading. Her library was legendary, her politics progressive for the 18th century. But power makes hypocrites of us all. So does loneliness. And speaking of strange companions, our next ruler believed a consul was best represented by 4 legs, a tail, and an impeccable sense of loyalty. Emperor Caligula of Rome famously made his horse, Incitatus, a consul, and allegedly planned to make him a priest. Some rulers fake humility, others skip straight to satire. Caligula, Rome's most extravagant middle finger to politics, didn't just disrespect the Senate, humiliated it with hooves. His horse, Incitatus, reportedly had a marble stall, a jeweled collar, and his own servants. When Caligula suggested making him a consul, the Senate balked. Caligula laughed. Power was a joke, and they were the punchline. But was it madness or genius-level trolling? Naming a horse to high office was a performance piece on par with modern absurdist theater. It said, "Your government is a circus." I'm just being honest about the clowns. And maybe that honesty is what terrified them most. This wasn't incompetence, it was contempt in a toga. He turned the empire's rituals into sketches. Sacred rites into setups for punchlines? His rule burned fast and weird. Paranoia, assassination plots, public executions as weekend entertainment. In the end, his enemies stabbed him 30 times for the same reason they once followed him, because he reminded them that nothing was sacred, especially not the Senate. Which makes the next monarch's idea of sacred look quaint. She worshipped legacy, lineage, and an empire stitched together by grandchildren and genetic time bombs. Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom had 9 children, 42 grandchildren, and was a carrier of hemophilia, which spread among European royal houses. Queen Victoria, matriarch of the stiff upper lip empire, did something no British monarch had done before. She turned her womb into a diplomatic weapon. 9 children, 40, 2 grandchildren. Enough royal DNA to seed an entire continent with powdered wigs and tragic blood disorders. At the time, this was considered a feat. Today, it'd trigger a global intervention. But Victoria wasn't just a grandmother in mourning veils. She was the unsuspecting carrier of a genetic mutation, hemophilia, a disease that thins the blood and thickens the irony. Her sons bled uncontrollably from minor cuts. Her grandsons limped through history, unable to play soldiers without risking death by bruise. The disease quietly crept into the courts of Spain, Germany, and most famously, Russia, where it haunted the Romanovs and helped spark revolution. All from one royal chromosome, passed along like a cursed heirloom. Yet the empire carried on, its queen draped in black for 4 decades, mourning her beloved Albert, and the slow, invisible unraveling of a dynasty. The Victorian age was cleanliness, conquest, and repression, plus a few transfusions and cover-ups. And if that sounds a little manicured, just wait until you meet a monarch who micromanaged his image so obsessively, even his hair came with a job title. King Louis XIV of France, the Sunday King, was obsessed with his image and had 413 wigs made for him. Louis XIV didn't just rule France, performed France. Every morning, he was woken by a choreographed ballet of courtiers. Every bowel movement had an audience. He transformed monarchy into theater and cast himself as the sun around which all orbit. And like any lead actor, he demanded the best costume, specifically 413 wigs, each more flamboyant than the last, not just vanity, policy. Every curl, a reminder. You are not the state I am. The wigs weren't optional. Nobles copied him like fangirls at Versailles, suffocating under powdered hair in the July heat, terrified of looking underdressed at the morning lever. Louis dictated fashion, behavior, architecture, and even posture. He didn't just want control, he wanted authorship. Reality was a stage. Versailles, the set. France, the script. But beneath the gloss, starvation, war, crushed uprisings. While peasants ate bark, their king paraded down mirror halls, reflecting only himself. His obsession with image was more than ego, it was governance by illusion. Style as submission, excess as enforcement. And when he finally died, his embalmed body leaked from the coffin. A man so obsessed with appearance, reduced to a dripping mess, but death has no taste. Unlike the next ruler, who refused to taste love itself, Queen Elizabeth I of England had a serious fear of marriage and never took a husband, earning her the nickname the Virgin Queen. She was courted by kings, pawed at by ambassadors, serenaded by poets. But Elizabeth I had one lover she never abandoned: power. She wore it like a crown of thorns, glorious, burdensome, and sharp enough to slice through suitors. Her refusal to marry was not mere sentiment, it was strategy. In a world where queens were expected to wed and breed, Elizabeth carved out a third option: rule alone, answer to no one, and weaponize virginity into myth. Her unmarried status became political theater. England was her husband, she said, her body politic, her chastity, a national virtue. But behind the slogans were calculations sharper than any blade. She knew that marriage meant surrender of autonomy, of authority, of leverage. So she dangled promises, flirted diplomatically, and never signed the contract. And the men? They raged, conspired, wooed, and eventually died waiting. Still, rumors swirled, secret affairs, bastards, night visits from the Earl of Leicester. But even if true, they were irrelevant. The image mattered more. Elizabeth crafted herself into a secular saint, a living contradiction, untouchable yet adored, alone yet supreme. She ruled longer than most men, outmaneuvered half of Europe, and died unwed, unbroken, and undefeated. The perfect setup for a king who did marry, and then kept doing it. Again, and again, and again. King Henry VIII of England was not only famous for his 6 wives, but also for being an accomplished musician and composer. If Tinder had existed in the 16th century, Henry VIII would have swiped right on marriage and left on mercy. His love life reads like a medieval horror anthology: divorce, execution, more divorce, mysterious death, more execution, and finally, one survivor who probably slept with a dagger under her pillow. But what gets buried under the mound of beheaded queens is the fact that Henry was a genuinely gifted musician. Before he grew into the gout-ridden tyrant of portraits, Henry was a charming, athletic Renaissance prince. He composed music, some of it romantic, some suspiciously plagiarized, including the famous Pastime with Good Company, which he probably sang between annulments. He played the lute, the organ, and even wrote masses. At one point, he had the musical talent, charisma, and ambition to be England's golden boy. Then came the religious schism, the split from Rome, the creation of the Church of England, all to annul one marriage. Suddenly, Henry's compositions became less about harmony and more about domination. He ruled with an ego as bloated as his waistline, writing checks his conscience couldn't cash. So yes, he was a musician, a king of rhythm and ruptures, which takes us fittingly to another royal reformerless, bloody, more sun-obsessed, and arguably just as radical. 7 monarchs down, 92 more crown-wearing oddities to go. If you're still with us, you're officially part of the royal court of the chronically curious, so why not make it official? Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another descent into historical absurdity. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Are you doom scrolling at 3 a.m. in Toronto or sipping coffee at noon in Nairobi? We want to know which time zone this madness has reached. Pharaoh Akhenaten of Egypt tried to introduce a monotheistic religion, worshipping only the sun god Aten, a radical departure from traditional Egyptian polytheism. Long before revolutions came with guillotines and pamphlets, they came with sun discs and divine rebranding. Pharaoh Akhenaten didn't just tinker with Egypt's theology, he detonated it. For centuries, the Egyptians had juggled a complex pantheon of gods with enough animal heads to start a zoo. Then Akhenaten shows up, declares all of them obsolete, and insists the sun Atenis the one true god. Monotheism, centuries ahead of its time, dropped like a chisel into a sea of tradition. He moved the capital to a brand new city, Amarna. He banned old gods. He altered art styles to show himself in elongated, almost alien form-soft bellies, wide hips, and androgynous features. Statues of other deities were smashed. Priests were sidelined. Religion was no longer a polyphonic operate, was a solo, and Akhenaten conducted it shirtless in the desert. The backlash, of course, was biblical. After his death, his son Tutankhamun was swiftly returned to the old gods. Akhenaten's city was abandoned, his name chiseled out from monuments. Heresy doesn't age well in stone, but ideas have long shadows. Some see in him the blueprint for later monotheistic religions. Others see a megalomaniac chasing immortality. Which brings us to a woman who climbed the imperial ladder from concubine to empress with her own taste for reinvention and blood. Empress Wu Zetian of China was the only female emperor of China and started her career as a concubine before rising to ultimate power. She was known for her ruthlessness and intelligence. In the Confucian rulebook of ancient China, women were to be quiet, obedient, and ideally invisible. Empress Wu Zetian read that book and burned it. She entered the imperial court as a concubine, maneuvered her way into the emperor's bed, and then, through a stunning mix of patience, seduction, political calculation, and alleged murder, ascended to the highest throne in the land, not as empress consort, not as regent, but as emperor's only woman in Chinese history to claim that title outright. Her intelligence was undeniable. So was her ruthlessness. Political opponents mysteriously vanished. Accusations of poisonings, strangulations, and exile followed her. Rise like incense, smoke hard to grasp, impossible to ignore. But she also lifted up scholars, reformed the bureaucracy, and promoted women in a deeply patriarchal system, a monster to some, a visionary to others. Wu rewrote her story in real time, commissioning works that portrayed her as a Buddhist savior. She built temples and monuments that sanctified her rule. But beneath the divine glow was a woman who refused to be footnoted in someone else's legacy. And if you think ruling by poetry and poison is impressive, wait until you meet a man who wielded both gold and verse with a scimitar tucked quietly behind his pen. Sultan Suleiman, the Magnificent of the Ottoman Empire, was also a skilled goldsmith and wrote poetry under the pen name Muhibi. History likes its conquerors loud and blood-stained. Suleiman the Magnificent? He preferred verse. The man who stretched the Ottoman Empire across 3 continents also crafted delicate rings, engraved intricate seals, and penned poetry under the pseudonym Muhibi the Lover. Imagine Napoleon spending his downtime etching wedding bands or Caesar composing haikus. That was Suleiman. Empire, builder by day, hopeless romantic by candlelight. But make no mistake, he wasn't soft. His military campaigns were brutal, his court politics lethal, and his enemies plentiful. Yet the same hand that signed off on executions also wrote love poems to his wife, Hürrem Sultana, former slave who became one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history. Their correspondence reads like a 16th century soap opera, one with more gold, more blood, and significantly better calligraphy. As a goldsmith, Suleiman understood that power, like metal, must be shaped carefully. Too much pressure, and it cracks. Too little, and it bends. He ruled with both precision and performance, wrapping his brutality in aesthetics. His legacy? A sultan who saw no contradiction in carving out an empire and a sonnet in the same breath. Which brings us to another monarch who built empires and bonfires. All in the name of God, discovery, and terror. Queen Isabella I of Castile was instrumental in funding Christopher Columbus's voyage to the Americas, but was also known for establishing the Spanish Inquisition. Isabella I, the pious queen who gave the world the New World and the rack. On the one hand, she funded Columbus, unleashing a wave of exploration, conquest, and eventual colonial catastrophe. On the other, she institutionalized the Spanish Inquisition, an unholy bureaucracy of torture, paranoia, and religious cleansing that would make Orwell blush. She and her husband Ferdinand completed the Reconquista, reclaiming Spain from Muslim rule, then turned their gaze inward. Jews and Muslims were expelled or forcibly converted. Heretics were tortured until confession, then burned for their honesty, all under the banner of spiritual purification. And yet, Isabella wasn't a cartoon villain. She was devout, intelligent, and ruthlessly pragmatic. She saw unity not as diversity but uniformity. Religion was statecraft. Torture, a form of truth extraction. Columbus was just another investment to risk portfolio with ships. The contradiction is staggering. She opened the gates of empire while closing the doors of tolerance. Her crown gave birth to both global trade and global suffering. Her court hosted prayers, flames, and unmarked graves. And speaking of royal minds unraveling under the weight of invisible wounds, let's pivot to a king who thought he was made of glass. King Charles VI of France, known as Charles the Mad, suffered from severe mental illness and sometimes believed he was made of glass. If power protects, Charles VI never got the memo. France's king spent long stretches of his reign believing he would shatter. Not metaphorically, literally. He thought his body was made of glass. He wore reinforced clothing to prevent cracks. He forbade anyone from touching him. At court, people moved around him like careful waiters balancing crystal stemware. His episodes were erratic and terrifying. He'd run screaming through halls, forget his name, and slaughter his own knights in confused rages. And then, as quickly as a thunderstorm, he'd be lucid gentle even. The court held its breath, waiting for the next break in the weather. The irony? Charles came to power with high hopes, a young, idealistic monarch with a taste for festivities. But the pressure of ruling a divided, war-torn France with the 100 Years' War still grinding on seemed to crack something inside him. Or maybe it was inherited madness, the royal bloodline corroding from within. Either way, the kingdom didn't wait. Power shifted to his uncles, his wife, and finally to chaos. France drifted while its king hid behind imagined fragility. And now, from a man afraid to break, to a woman who broke through, ruling not from a throne but from behind a curtain of silks, whispers, and poison. Empress Dowager Cixi of China effectively ruled China for decades from behind the scenes, despite never officially being empress regnant. She was also known for her love of jade and elaborate banquets. She never wore the crown, but everyone knew who ruled. Empress Dowager Cixi entered the Qing court as a low-ranking concubine and clawed her way up through palace intrigue, strategic childbearing, and eventually the slow suffocation of her political rivals. When her son officially, the emperor, ascended the throne at age 5, Cixi seized the role of regent, and she never let go. For nearly half a century, she pulled imperial strings from behind silk screens, veiled in tradition but wielding absolute authority. Her rule was marked by contradiction. She halted reforms that might have modernized China, yet selectively embraced Western technology, telegraphs, railways, and photography, as long as they didn't threaten her grip on power. Her lavish lifestyle was legendary. Banquets with 150 dishes, massive jade collections, an infamous marble boat built using Navy funds because nothing says stability like sinking metaphors. While peasants starved and foreign powers carved up China, she was sculpting a legacy in stone and silk. To her supporters, she was a stabilizing force in a crumbling dynasty. To others, she was the reason it crumbled. A woman who ruled without a title, protected her throne with concubines and cuisine, and left China teetering at the edge of revolution. Which takes us to a king who also couldn't stop taking, especially things that didn't belong to him. King Farouk I of Egypt was a notorious kleptomaniac, even stealing a pocket watch from Winston Churchill. Royalty tends to hoard, but King Farouk I of Egypt took it to Olympic levels of theft. He was the kind of monarch who would shake your hand while lifting your wallet hand, then have it gold-plated. Farouk wasn't just rich and corrupt, he was also a compulsive kleptomaniac with a taste for absurd trophies. During a state visit with Winston Churchill, he allegedly swiped the man's pocket watch. Not out of need, just because. His personal collection included coins, stamps, pornographic postcards, and nearly 8,500 walking sticks. Some say he once tried to steal a sword from a ceremonial garden a whim. He also had a thing for fancy cars, most of which he didn't pay for, and a national treasury that mysteriously shrank during his reign. Farouk ruled Egypt during a time of political unrest, economic disparity, and looming revolution. His personal excess became a symbol of national rot. While Cairo baked under colonial tension and poverty, Farouk partied in silk pajamas and played blackjack with dictators. Eventually, the army had enough. In 1952, he was overthrown and exiled, reportedly fleeing with over 300 suitcases. Among them, who knows, probably Churchill's watch. And now, let's talk about a queen who ran from the throne not with luggage, but with curiosity. Queen Christina of Sweden abdicated her throne, converted to Catholicism, and moved to Rome, preferring intellectual pursuits over ruling. Queens don't usually quit, but Christina of Sweden did spectacularly. In 1654, after a reign marked by eccentricity, ambiguity, and philosophical obsession, she shocked Europe by abdicating her throne. The reason? She was bored, or maybe disillusioned. Or maybe just done with the absurdity of being a female monarch in a Lutheran kingdom that valued war more than wit. Raised as a prince literally, they educated her like a boy Christina was brilliant, multilingual, and impossible to categorize. She invited Descartes to her court, where he promptly caught pneumonia and died, wore men's clothing, refused to marry, and once claimed she had a man's soul in a woman's body. Sweden expected her to breed heirs. Christina preferred Latin debates and elaborate disguises. After abdicating, she rode off to Rome and converted to Catholicism, a massive scandal for a Protestant queen. In Italy, she rebranded herself as a cultural patron, collecting art, philosophy, and scandal in equal measure. She dined with cardinals, philosophized with popes, and left everyone guessing about her true beliefs, her sexuality, and her endgame. Christina didn't just leave the throne, she left the script. And next comes a king who rewrote the fairy tale entirely by building castles that looked like bedtime stories and living inside the delusion. King Ludwig II of Bavaria, the Mad King, was obsessed with building elaborate fairy tale castles like Neuschwanstein, leading to financial ruin and his eventual deposition. There are kings who build empires, and then there's Ludwig the Third who built dreams, expensive, towering marble and gilded dreams that drained Bavaria's treasury like an open wound. Ludwig wasn't interested in politics or policy. He was interested in Wagnerian operas, swan motifs, and surrounding himself with towering turrets that touched the sky. His crowning obsession? Neuschwanstein Castle part, Gothic fantasy, part architectural hallucination. To the world, Ludwig was mad. To him, reality was the problem. He retreated from court life and into fairy tale stonework, communicating mostly by letter, avoiding human contact, and commissioning ever more extravagant palaces no one could live in. Ministers begged him to stop. He kept signing checks. By the time of his deposition, he was over 14 million marks in debt and still planning another castle. Eventually, his own government declared him insane and removed him from power without so much as a diagnosis. Days later, he was found dead in Lake Starnberg alongside his psychiatrist. No one knows how they died. Suicide? Murder? Madness? Ludwig left behind castles and questions. He didn't just blur the line between reality and fantasy, he lived on the wrong side of it. Which takes us from castles in the clouds to a city reduced to smoke while its emperor fiddled with verse. Emperor Nero of Rome was rumored to have fiddled while Rome burned. Though this is likely an exaggeration, he did write poetry about the fire. The image is perfect. Nero, strumming his lyre atop a hill, while Rome devours itself in flames. A villain so perfectly detached he sets the tone for every self-absorbed leader to follow. Unfortunately, it's also probably fiction. There were no fiddles in first-century Rome, and Nero wasn't even in the city when the fire started. But what he did do was almost stranger. When Rome burned in 64 CE, destroying 10 of the city's 14 districts, Nero returned not as a grieving emperor, but as a playwright. He recited poetry about the devastation. He blamed Christians for the blaze and crucified them en masse, lighting their bodies as torches for his gardens. He also used the cleared land to build his personal palace, the Domus Aurea, complete with a rotating dining room and a 100-foot bronze statue of himself. So maybe he didn't cause the fire, but he certainly capitalized on it. Nero didn't want to rebuild Rome, wanted to reshape it in his image. Fire, poetry, and public executions were merely tools. A man with a god complex and no editor is dangerous. And yet, his love life was surprisingly sincere compared to our next monarch who ruled with fire, faith, and a disturbingly large pile of corpses. Queen Mary the First of England, Bloody Mary, was a devout Catholic who executed hundreds of Protestants, but she also had a genuine love for her husband, Philip II of Spain. Mary Tudor didn't just reign, she purified, or tried to. As the first woman to rule England in her own right, Mary was determined to cleanse the kingdom of Protestant heresy. What followed was a reign soaked in fire and fear. Over 280 Protestants burned at the stake in just 5 years, often publicly and with state approval. The crowds cheered, wept, or simply watched. And Mary earned her nickname, Bloody Mary. But beneath the fanaticism was a woman desperately grasping for order in a kingdom that had turned its back on her faith, her mother, and her legitimacy. Her father, Henry VIII, shattered the Catholic Church in England. Mary tried to weld it back together with smoke and iron. It didn't work. She married Philip II of Spain in hopes of solidifying her power, restoring Catholicism, and perhaps, finally, producing an heir. Instead, she suffered multiple phantom pregnancies. The child never came. Neither did love in return. Philip left her behind in England, more symbol than spouse. Mary died heartbroken, childless, and reviled by many. Yet her reign laid the groundwork for her half-sister Elizabeth, who would take a different path, one paved with caution instead of fire. Next up, a king who tried to rule both church and cinema. King Alfonso XIII of Spain was a pioneer of early cinema, funding and appearing in some of Spain's first films. Before European monarchs discovered television, Alfonso XIII discovered film reels. Born posthumously in 1886, literally declared king the moment he entered the world, Alfonso grew up under the limelight and, eventually, into it. He wasn't just a fan of cinema, he was an early financier, producer, and even occasional star. Picture a monarch not just watching silent films, but helping make them, fiddling with production budgets in between state ceremonies. His reign was complicated, marked by political instability, dictatorship, and eventual exile, but behind the scenes, Alfonso was producing motion pictures, including some risque, even pornographic content under pseudonyms. Yes, the King of Spain might have funded royal softcore. It's not in most textbooks, but the reels discovered years later in dusty Archive-speak volumes. Alfonso's cinematic interests weren't just artistic, they were escapist. While Spain unraveled under his rule, he was busy playing director of a more controllable world. He embraced modernity but couldn't contain the storm of nationalism, republicanism, and social unrest that eventually pushed him into exile. Cinema was his sanctuary, his illusion of authorship in a country slipping from his grip. And speaking of illusions, our next empress began her life on the stage and ended it on a throne made of scandal and survival. Empress Theodora of Byzantium started her life as an actress and courtesan before marrying Emperor Justinian I and becoming one of the most powerful women in Byzantine history. If you wanted to make a Roman senator choke on his date-stuffed peacock, just whisper Theodora's name. She began in the gutter, literally, on the stages and brothels of Constantinople, performing provocative pantomimes and scandalous acts that made her infamous. In a society where actresses were barely considered human, Theodora rewrote the narrative. Through wit, grit, and unmatched charisma, she caught the eye of Justinian, heir to the Byzantine Empire. They married illegally at first, and when he took the throne, she rose beside him, not behind. Theodora didn't just advise. She commanded, she quashed riots, rewrote laws to protect women and children, secured her allies, poisoned her enemies. When the Nika revolt nearly destroyed Constantinople, Justinian considered fleeing. Theodora reportedly told him she'd rather die in royal purple than live in exile. He stayed. They crushed the uprising. Her power was both unprecedented and resented. Historians, mostly male, mostly biased, painted her as a temptress, a manipulator, a sinner in silks, but they couldn't erase her legacy. A courtesan who rose to co-ruler, wielding influence as sharp as any blade. Which brings us to another ruler molded by deformity, incest, and a funeral mask of gold. King Tutankhamun of Egypt had a club foot and a cleft palate, and DNA evidence suggests his parents were full siblings. Tutankhamun, the golden boy of ancient Egypt. Dead at 19, entombed in splendor, and later turned into a 20th century media sensation when Howard Carter cracked open his burial chamber. But the truth beneath the gold leaf is darker, sadder, and grotesquely human. Thanks to modern DNA analysis, we now know the boy king was a walking testament to royal inbreeding. His parents? Brother and sister. A genetic Hail Mary that left him with a club foot, cleft palate, and a cocktail of congenital issues. He probably needed a cane to walk. Dozens were found in his tombstone, visibly worn. He wasn't a mighty warrior or a grand builder. He was a fragile figurehead, placed on the throne after the death of Akhenaten and used to reset the religious clock. His brief reign was essentially a political reboot. The Aten experiment was abandoned, the old gods restored, and Tutankhamun's name used to smooth over theological whiplash. And yet, it's the gold mask we remember, not the genetic tragedy beneath it. A face frozen in perfection, hiding a lineage that collapsed under its own sacred bloodlines. Now meet a queen who dealt with rebellion the old-fashioned way, with poison, fire, and an open invitation to mass death. Queen Ranavalona I of Madagascar was known as the Cruel Queen and ordered the deaths of tens of thousands of her subjects, often through brutal Tangina poison ordeals. To call Queen Ranavalona cruel is putting it gently, as if her reign were a mildly unpleasant chapter in an otherwise sunny island history. In reality, she turned Madagascar into a throne-shaped torture chamber. Reigning from 1828 to 1861, Ranavalona viewed foreign influence and internal dissent as diseases best cured with furent poison. Her favorite method of justice? The Tangina ordeal, a sacred nut mashed into a potion, then swallowed by the accused. If you vomited, you were innocent. If not, well, your innocence hardly mattered, since survival was rare. Tens of thousands perished this way, their guilt less important than their ability to digest. She expelled Christian missionaries, slaughtered converts, and turned modernization attempts into cautionary tales. Foreigners dubbed her mad. Locals whispered legends about her sorcery. Her rule was isolationist to the point of paranoia, brutal in both public spectacle and private policy. And yet, she kept Madagascar independent at terrible cost. Her reign challenges the easy narrative of colonial resistance. She fought imperialism with blood, not diplomacy. Which leads us to another monarch who famously walked away from an empire for love, scandal, and a woman twice divorced. King Edward VIII of the United Kingdom abdicated the throne to marry American divorcee Wallis Simpson, causing a constitutional crisis. Edward VIII was born to be king, raised in palaces, trained in protocol, tailor-fitted for duty, and he threw it all away for Wallis. Twice divorced, sharp-tongued, an American everything the monarchy wasn't. Their romance wasn't just taboo, it was combustible. In 1936, with the throne barely warm beneath him, Edward declared he couldn't rule without the woman I love. The press gasped, Parliament seethed. Britain, already tiptoeing into global war, was now also watching a real-life royal soap opera unfold. So he abdicated, just gave it up. The crown passed to his stammering brother George VI, and Edward became the Duke of Windsor, a title soaked in exile and regret. But the abdication wasn't just about love. Edward's political sympathies leaned dangerously toward fascism. His visit to Nazi Germany in 1937, complete with salutes and smiles, suggests Wallis wasn't the only reason he had to go. Their marriage endured, but so did the whispers. Were they traitors? Just romantics? Or something murkier? The monarchy survived. Edward didn't thrive. He spent the rest of his life on the margins, always well-dressed, never quite welcome. Which takes us, musically, to a king who found comfort not in scandal but in sonatas and dogs, King Frederick II of Prussia. Frederick the Great was a talented flutist and a close friend of Voltaire. He also loved his greyhounds immensely. Prussia's most formidable king wasn't forged in the fire of battle. He was shaped by music, philosophy, and the soft nose of a greyhound. Frederick II, known as the Great, had a mind that hungered for ideas and harmony. As a child, he preferred his flute to his sword. His father, a strict militarist, beat him for it. When Frederick tried to flee the palace, his father had his closest friend executed in front of him. That's one way to bond over family values. And yet, Frederick emerged from trauma with a curious duality. A ruthless strategist on the battlefield and a sensitive artist off it. He composed music, hosted Voltaire at his court before their friendship combusted in passive-aggressive letters, and governed with enlightenment, ideals selectively applied, of course. He embraced religious tolerance but crushed uprisings. He admired Rousseau but expanded his military like a man collecting action figures. His true love? Greyhounds. He kept many, buried them with inscriptions, and insisted on being laid to rest beside them. Not generals, not lovers, dogs. A philosopher king, a lonely son, a battlefield tactician who sought solace in chamber music and wet noses. And now, from one fierce ruler to another only, this time in chainmail and disguise. Queen Tamar of Georgia was a powerful female ruler in the 12th century, leading her kingdom to its golden age and often dressing in male attire for battle. In an era when women were expected to rule from behind veils or not at all, Queen Tamar of Georgia donned chainmail and dared anyone to blink. Crowned as King of Kings in 1184, Notquinch ruled a fractured feudal land and turned it into the most powerful kingdom in the Caucasus. A devout Christian and shrewd tactician, she expanded Georgia's borders through diplomacy, military campaigns, and carefully orchestrated marriages, sometimes her own, sometimes others. And yet, her greatest victories weren't on the battlefield but in perception. Her authority was constantly questioned, undermined by male nobles who thought they could puppet her. Tamar outmaneuvered them all. She wore men's clothing into war, commanded armies like a seasoned general, and cultivated a divine image of herself as God's chosen ruler. Her reign brought a flourishing of literature, architecture, and religious influence the Georgian Renaissance. Legend blurred with reality. In art, she was often depicted haloed, armored, and triumphant, not queen-likingly. And while Europe grappled with succession crises and papal tantrums, Tamar simply ruled. From a woman who defied her gender, we now turn to a man who disarmed his own generals just to ensure he'd never have to fight them. Emperor Taizu of Song, China, the founder of the Song dynasty, was a former military general who strategically disarmed his powerful subordinates to consolidate his rule peacefully. You don't usually become emperor by playing nice with the army, but Emperor Taizu of Song broke the pattern by being cleverer than his sword. After founding the Song dynasty in 960 CE, Zhao Guanyin, latter known as Emperor Taizu, faced a problem common to all freshly minted monarchs. What do you do with the powerful warlords who helped you rise? He invited them to a feast. Wine flowed, food dazzled. Then, once the generals were sufficiently loosened by alcohol and ego, he gently suggested they retire with full honors, generous pensions, and absolutely no risk of assassination. Most of them agreed. Miraculously, none of them revolted. Why fight a civil war when you can retire rich and unstabbed? Taizu's strategy wasn't cowardice, was vision. He shifted power from the military to a centralized civil bureaucracy, laying the groundwork for one of China's most intellectually vibrant dynasties. He valued scholars over swords, exams over executions, a rare emperor who saw stability as more than just enforced silence. But peace has its own costs. As the military weakened, the Song would later struggle against foreign invasions. A reminder, when you put down the sword, you'd better make sure no one else picks it up. Which leads us to a king who ruled not through intellect or strategy, but through sheer, chaotic fertility. King Charles II of England had numerous mistresses and acknowledged 14 illegitimate children, but no legitimate heirs, leading to his brother's succession. Charles II returned to the English throne in 1660 with a simple agenda: never be boring again. After the grey puritanical rule of Oliver Cromwell, Charles brought back music, theater, gambling, and enough court scandals to fuel centuries of tabloid journalism. He reigned like a man making up for lost time, and he was. He fathered at least 14 illegitimate children, none of whom could inherit the crown. He acknowledged many of them publicly, granting titles and lands, while his official queen, Catherine of Braganza, remained childless. The royal nursery was full of bastards and empty of heirs. His mistresses were celebrities in their own right. Nell Gwynn, the witty actress; Barbara Palma, the tempestuous aristocrat; Louise de Kerouaille, the French agent with a velvet smile. His court was nicknamed the Merry Court, but beneath the laughter loomed the specter of instability. No legitimate successor meant the throne would pass to his brother James the Catholic. That little detail would eventually tear the country apart. Charles, however, didn't seem to mind. When warned of a dangerous political move, he supposedly replied, "I'm afraid of no man but my mistress." Next, a shy king with a stammer and a chessboard who ruled like a pawn trapped on the wrong square. King Louis XIII of France was known for his shyness and stammer, but was also a skilled hunter and enjoyed playing chess. In the Grand Theatre of Versailles, Louis XIII was more background actor than leading man. Overshadowed by his larger-than-life son, Louis XIV, and his cunning chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, Louis XIII often appears in history as the awkward footnote between two powerful paragraphs. But his reign was more than royal filler. It was a chess match played with trembling hands. Shy, sensitive, and stammering, Louis wasn't built for court theatrics. He struggled with public speaking, avoided emotional intimacy, and showed little flair for politics. Yet in solitude, he thrived. He was an avid chess player, methodical, calculating, quietly ruthless, and a passionate hunter, finding solace in forests where the prey didn't whisper behind his back. Despite his hesitance, Louis XIII was not weak. Under his rule, France took significant steps towards centralized monarchy. With Richelieu pulling political strings, they cracked down on noble revolts and Protestant strongholds, setting the stage for the absolute monarchy his son would later perfect. But Louis remained a ghost in his own palace, always present, rarely seen. A king more comfortable with hawks than courtiers, he played power like a cautious endgame, always a few moves ahead, always afraid to speak the checkmate aloud. Now let's pivot from a man who couldn't produce a decisive heir to a queen who produced 17 and still lost them all. Queen Anne of Great Britain suffered from numerous miscarriages and bore 17 children, none of whom survived to adulthood, leading to the end of the Stuart dynasty. In the history of monarchs, few stories are more quietly devastating than Queen Anne's. Crowned in 1702, she ruled during a period of seismic political shifts uniting England and Scotland into Great Britain, overseeing wars and party politics. But behind the scenes, her reign was marked by a relentless cycle of hope, loss, and grief. 17 pregnancies, 17 tragedies, miscarriages, stillbirths, infants lost to illness. Her only child to survive infancy, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, died at age 11. Anne, swollen with pain both physical and emotional, watched her legacy dissolve in the crib. She was often ill herself, plagued by gout and obesity, physically collapsing as her dynasty did the same. Her political decisions were often influenced by her closest female confidantes, most famously Sarah Churchill, whose friendship unraveled into bitterness and betrayal. Meanwhile, Anne mourned not just the children she lost, but the future they represented. When she died in 1714, the Stuart line died with her. Her body, reportedly so swollen it took hours to move, was laid in Westminster Abbey, surrounded not by heirs, but by silence. A queen who gave her country unity, but could never give it a future. And now, from personal decay to courageous defiance, meet the leper king who refused to yield to disease or death. King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, the leper king, bravely led his armies in battle despite suffering from leprosy, often riding in full armor. Most kings fear betrayal, invasion, or scandal. Baldwin IV feared disintegration. Diagnosed with leprosy as a child, he should have been relegated to the sidelines of history. Instead, he climbed atop a war horse, donned armor over rotting skin, and ruled the kingdom of Jerusalem like a man who didn't realize he was supposed to be dying. In the 12th century, leprosy was more than a death sentence, it was a social erasure. The disease twisted bodies, deadened limbs, and marked sufferers as cursed. But Baldwin's mind remained razor sharp. He studied military tactics, politics, and theology. He beat back Saladin's forces at Monkey's leading his knights with a face half covered in cloth, hiding what the disease had taken. His reign was short but legendary. He knew he couldn't rule forever and tried to ensure a stable succession, but politics, as always, had other plans. Intrigue at court, rival factions, and Saladin's rising power would undo much of Baldwin's legacy after his death at just 24. But in life, he embodied something few monarchs manage: nobility, not of bloodline or crown, but of stubborn, defiant spirit. Next, the emperor who feared death so much, he tried to outlive it chemically and paid the price. Emperor Qin Shi Huang of China, the first emperor, was obsessed with immortality and consumed mercury pills, which likely contributed to his death. Qin Shi Huang didn't just want to unify Qinghai, wanted to outlive it. After conquering the warring states and proclaiming himself the first emperor in 221 BCE, he began a lifelong obsession with immortality. Convinced that death was optional with the right alchemy, he dispatched fleets in search of mythical elixirs, consulted magicians, and, most ironically, swallowed mercury like it was herbal tea. His quest for eternal life was grand, theatrical, and ultimately fatal. The very pills meant to preserve his youth likely destroyed his nervous system and mind. He became increasingly paranoid and erratic, moving between palaces in secret, terrified of assassination and obsessed with omens. Ironically, in trying to cheat death, he poisoned himself slowly and meticulously. Still, he planned for death with unmatched grandeur. His tomb, yet to be fully excavated, reportedly contains rivers of mercury, a full-scale replica of his empire, and 8,000 terracotta soldiers ready to protect him in the afterlife. He couldn't live forever, but he made damn sure he wouldn't be forgotten. And while Qin tried to preserve his reign through artificial means, the next queen chose fire, myth, and mass sacrifice to seal her place in legend. Queen Padmini of Chittor, India, a legendary queen, is said to have committed jauhar, mass self-immolation, with other women to avoid capture by an invading sultan. The story of Queen Padmini is so soaked in fire and poetry that historians still argue whether she truly existed. But myth or not, her legend has burned itself into the soul of Rajasthan. According to the epic Padmavat, Padmini was a Rajput queen of extraordinary beauty. So extraordinary, in fact, that when Sultan Alauddin Khilji heard of her, he launched a siege on Chittor just to claim her. Rather than be taken captive, defiled, enslaved, paraded Padmini and hundreds of other women chose jauhar, mass self-immolation, Wrapped in red, chanting hymns, they walked into flames. Behind them, the men rode out to die in a hopeless final charge. It was both act of defiance and Aurora ritual of purity at the edge of annihilation. Modern eyes struggle with this image. Was it martyrdom, misogyny dressed in honor, or something far more complex and apocalyptic refusal to surrender to domination? Whatever the answer, the tale endures. In marble palaces, Bollywood adaptations, and whispered folk tales, Padmini's fire still flickers. But now, from legendary flames to a modern gunshot, we pivot to a king whose royal dinner ended in a massacre, and a monarchy that never truly recovered. King Birendra of Nepal and most of his family were tragically killed in a royal massacre in 2001, allegedly by his son, Crown Prince Dipendra. The end of Nepal's monarchy wasn't a revolution, it was a family dinner. On the 1st of June, 2001, King Birendra, beloved and mild-mannered, sat down for a royal banquet. By night's end, most of the royal family lay dead. The alleged gunman, Crown Prince Dipendra, heir to the throne, educated in Britain, and reportedly enraged over a forbidden love affair and disputes over succession. The official story goes like this. Dipendra arrived drunk, armed, and dressed in military gear. He gunned down his father, mother, siblings, and various relatives before turning the weapon on himself. Comatose but not dead, Dipendra was declared king while unconscious. He ruled for 3 days before dying, leaving a shocked nation staring into a void. The massacre shattered the illusion of divine royalty. In a culture that saw kings as avatars of Vishnu, this act was blasphemous, unspeakable, so much so that conspiracy theories flourished. Some believe it was a setup, a power grab, a cover-up. The facts remain hazy. What's clear is this: the monarchy never recovered. Within a few years, it was abolished entirely. The palace became a museum, the crown a relic. From fire to firearms, from legend to modern tragedy, our next monarch ruled with shadows in his mind and a puppet master behind his throne. That's 33 royal misadventures, and we've barely scratched the surface, so if you're still watching, you've clearly got the royal disease, incurable curiosity. Go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this absurd parade of crowns, castles, and questionable decisions. And tell us in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manila? Breakfast in Berlin? We're tracking royal ridiculousness across every time zone. King Christian VII of Denmark suffered from severe mental illness, allowing his personal physician, Johann Friedrich Struensee, to effectively rule the country for a period. By the time King Christian VII took the Danish throne in 1766, it was already clear that the crown sat uneasily atop his fragile mind. He suffered from what modern scholars now suspect was schizophrenia or severe bipolar disorder. Episodes of paranoia, erratic behavior, and prolonged catatonia marked his reign. He would slap courtiers without warning, hide under tables, and talk to himself for hours. For a man crowned absolute monarch, Christian wielded shockingly little control over anything, least of all himself. Enter Johann Friedrich Struensee, the king's physician, who quickly became much more than a doctor. With Christian retreating into delusions, Struensee stepped in to govern, issuing over 1,000 reformist laws in just 2 years. He abolished torture, improved press freedom, and championed Enlightenment ideals, all while secretly conducting an affair with Queen Caroline Matilda, the king's English wife. It ended, of course, in scandal and execution. Struensee was beheaded, drawn, and quartered. Caroline was exiled. Christian was returned to his shadowy throne, more puppet than king. He lived out his days in a palace-turned-prison, wandering the halls in isolation while Denmark moved on without him. From madness behind a throne, we move now to a queen whose own subjects cast her out and who spent the rest of her life in velvet exile. Queen Isabella II of Spain was overthrown by a revolution and lived a long life in exile, known for her extravagant lifestyle. Queen Isabella II's reign began in Diapers Ground at the age of 3 after her father's death and ended in disgrace, exile, and flamboyant oblivion. Her time on the Spanish throne from 1833 to 1868 was marred by political upheaval, military coups, and rampant scandal. She was accused of being an incompetent monarch, a pawn of clerics, and an instigator of favoritism and corruption. Also, her personal life was a royal mess. Her marriage to Francisco de Assis was famously cold, and her many rumored affairs made tabloid fodder of the monarchy long before tabloids existed. By 1868, the people had had enough. The Glorious Revolution forced her to abdicate, and she fled to Paris, where she leaned into her ex-monarch identity with reckless abandon. She became a symbol of royal absurdity, always overdressed, always dramatic, always dragging her past behind her like a gilded train. Isabella gambled, hosted lavish dinners, and gave interviews as if history were still waiting for her opinion. Despite her political failures, she lived well into her 70s and eventually abdicated in favor of her son, Alfonso XII, but the stain remained. She ruled a country that didn't want her and then entertained a continent that didn't need her. And now, to a king who reigned not with extravagance but with rhythm, to be exact. King Bhumibol Adulyadej of Thailand was the world's longest reigning monarch and a talented jazz musician, even playing with Benny Goodman. Most kings rule with scepters or swords. King Bhumibol Adulyadej ruled with a saxophone. The beloved monarch of Thailand, who reigned for over 70 years, was not only the world's longest-serving king at the time of his death, he was also a prolific jazz composer and performer. His musical idols weren't other royals but legends like Benny Goodman and Louis Armstrong. He played the clarinet, saxophone, trumpet, and piano with passion and technical skill. In his youth, he jammed with jazz, greats, and even composed dozens of songs that are still performed in Thailand today. Jazz wasn't just a hobby for Bhumibol, it was a philosophy. Improvise, harmonize, listen, lead without dominating. But his reign wasn't all bebop and syncopation. He ruled a country navigating coups, protests, and political unrest. Though a constitutional monarch, his influence was immense, often stepping in as a moral compass during crises. To many Thais, he wasn't just a king, he was a father figure, a saint, and a symbol of unity. Behind the calm voice and kind eyes was a man who saw life as a jazz solifol of improvisation, unexpected notes, and the power of restraint. Next, a woman whose obsession with beauty carved her into myth hand, nearly into marble. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, Sisi, was obsessed with her beauty and figure, engaging in extreme diets and exercise routines. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, affectionately and obsessively known as Sisi, treated her body like a sacred battleground. In an empire defined by stiff collars and stricter etiquette, Sisi sliced through royal expectations with a measuring tape and a fixation on waistlines. Her figure, famously corseted to a shocking 19 inches, became a personal religion. She weighed herself daily, recorded every ounce, and followed diets that bordered on starvation. Her meals were often raw meat, juice, oranges, and milk. She fasted like a monk with a personal trainer. But her obsession wasn't just vanity, it was rebellion. Married off at 15 to Emperor Franz Joseph, Sisi quickly found the Viennese court stifling, its gossip malicious, its expectations suffocating. So, she disappeared into travel, into exercise, into myth. She fenced, hiked mountains, and installed a private gym in the Hofburg Palace, complete with wall bars and rings. Her hair routine alone took 3 hours a day. Behind the public portraits of elegance was a woman unraveling. She fled court life, her children, and even her own identity, chasing beauty as if it could shield her from grief and control. It couldn't. But it did immortalize her. And speaking of foreign lands and royal confusion, we now turn to a king who never quite felt at home on his own throne. King Otto of Greece was born a Bavarian prince and struggled to adapt to Greek culture, often speaking German in his court. When Greece won its independence from the Ottoman Empire, Europe collectively decided the best follow-up was importing a teenage Bavarian prince. Enter Otto, crowned king of Greece in 1832, a monarch who didn't speak Greek, brought a Bavarian entourage, and ruled a nation he didn't understand. It was a cultural misfire of epic proportions, as if Greece had ordered democracy and got lederhosen instead. Otto meant well. He tried to modernize institutions, balance the warring factions of Greek politics, and build a stable state. But his aloofness, his Catholicism in an Orthodox nation, and his tendency to govern through German advisors soured public opinion quickly. At court, he spoke German. He dressed like a European romantic, not a Hellenic hero. His rule became an ongoing mismatch between image and identity. Eventually, the people had enough. After decades of unrest and failed reforms, he was forced into exile in 1862, leaving behind a country still trying to define itself and a monarch who never quite knew who he was supposed to be. And now, from forced exile to stolen sovereignty, we head to an island queen who sang her nation's sorrow as it was quietly erased beneath her. Queen Liliuokalani of Hawaii was the last reigning monarch of the Kingdom of Hawaii before it was overthrown and annexed by the United States. She was also a talented composer. Queen Liliuokalani didn't just lose her throne, she watched her kingdom vanish under the boots of foreign businessmen and Marines, one quietly signed treaty at a time. The first and only queen regnant of Hawaii, she ascended the throne in 1891 with hopes of restoring native power. Instead, she faced a coup backed by American sugar interests and approved, indirectly, by Washington. In 1893, a group of U.S.-aligned elites overthrew her with the support of the U.S. minister and troops from the USS Boston. Liliuokalani surrendered to avoid bloodshed, famously stating that she yielded her authority under protest, trusting that the United States would later do what was just. They didn't. She was placed under house arrest in her own palace. During that time, she composed songs, over 160 of them, including Aloha O, a farewell anthem soaked in longing. Her music became resistance, memory, and grief all in one. She spent her final years advocating for her people, writing her memoirs, and watching her homeland become a tourist destination rather than a sovereign state. A queen unthroned, yet not undone. And now, from one fading empire to another that barely had time to form, we meet a king born in revolt, crowned in compromise, and erased by oil. King Faisal I of Iraq was initially a leader of the Arab revolt during WWI and later became the first king of independent Iraq, but his reign was short-lived. King Faisal, I was a monarch, manufactured by maps. Born a Hashemite prince in Mecca, he helped lead the Arab revolt during World War I, riding camels across the desert with T.E. Lawrence, wielding tribal alliances like sabers and dreaming of an independent Arab kingdom. What he got instead was a seat at the post-war poker table, where Britain and France dealt the cards and kept the best hands for themselves. After the French booted him from Syria, the British handpicked Faisal to rule a newly invented nation, Iraq. It was a kingdom stitched together from Ottoman provinces, tribal divisions, and colonial interests, more a project than a country. Faisal barely spoke the local dialect and spent much of his time negotiating between British officials, Sunni elites, Shia majorities, and Kurdish minorities who didn't want to play empire. He tried to modernize, to unite, to balance, but his reign, despite its optimisms, was fragile. When he died in 1933 of a heart attack, some whisper poison, Iraq teetered back into unrest, coups, and conflict. He was a king without a crown-sized foundation. And next we meet a ruler whose crown never stopped shifting from monarch to filmmaker, from sovereign to star. King Norodom Sihanouk of Cambodia was a prolific filmmaker, composer, and lyricist, producing numerous movies and songs during his lifetime. Most kings don't make movies. Norodom Sihanouk made more than 50. The enigmatic and ever-shifting monarch of Cambodia directed, wrote, scored, and sometimes starred in his own films, mixing melodrama with propaganda, art with ambition. His cinematic tastes ranged from romance to war epics to musicals about nationalism, and he often cast himself in the roles of heroic lovers or tragic princes, mirrors of his own turbulent life. Sihanouk ruled, abdicated, returned, was ousted, returned again, and kept doing this until Cambodia was unrecognizable. At various points he was king, prince, head of state, figurehead, revolutionary ally, and exiled artist. His reign was less a political arc than a narrative montage. Smash cuts between colonial resistance, Cold War alignments, and Khmer Rouge horror. One moment he was sipping espresso with Mao, the next filming a musical in Phnom Penh. His films often screened to diplomats, and guests were his own kind of diplomacy. While regimes changed around him, Sihanouk maintained creative control of his image. It didn't save him from tragedy. His country would endure genocide and chaos, but it gave him a kind of immortality. And speaking of immortal legacies, the next emperor left his name carved in stone and admiration written in Greek. Emperor Hadrian of Rome was a prolific traveler, visiting almost every province of his empire, and was a great admirer of Greek culture. Some emperors conquered. Hadrian wandered. Unlike his predecessor Trajan, who expanded Rome's borders to their breaking point, Hadrian chose consolidation, traveling across the empire not as a conqueror, but as an inspector, builder, and occasional tourist. He visited nearly every province, from Britain to Judea, inspecting roads, hearing petitions, and occasionally redesigning entire cities because he didn't like the layout. His obsession with Greek culture bordered on cosplay. He wore Greek-style beards when the Roman elite were still clean-shaven. He spoke Greek fluently, studied philosophy, and even tried to turn Athens into the intellectual capital of the empire, sort of a classical Kickstarter project for enlightenment. Hadrian's most famous architectural legacy? A wall. Stretching across northern Britain, Hadrian's wall was less a fortress and more a warning. This is where civilization stops. Beyond here, be monsters. It still stands as a testament to Roman engineering and imperial insecurity. But perhaps his most haunting legacy was personal. His intense love for a young Greek man named Antinous, who died mysteriously in the Nile. Hadrian deified him, built cities in his name, and mourned him with monuments. An emperor who tried to rule not with the sword, but with style, stone, and a broken heart. Now meet a queen who wore a beard not for love, but for power. Queen Hatshepsut of Egypt often depicted herself with male characteristics, including a false beard, to assert her authority as pharaoh. In ancient Egypt, power had a wardrobe, and Hatshepsut raided it with precision. As the fifth pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, she broke convention not just by ruling as a woman, but by transforming herself into a man in the eyes of the state. She wore the traditional Nemes headdress, sported the false beard of kingship, and was even depicted with a flat chest in temple carvings. This wasn't confusion, it was strategy. Hatshepsut didn't just take power, she rebranded it. Officially, she was the regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III. Unofficially, she was running Egypt with brilliance, economic vision, and the kind of calm authority that male pharaohs often flailed their way through. Her reign was marked by prosperity, trade, expansions, most famously the expedition to the land of Punt, architectural marvels like her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, which still stuns visitors today. And yet, after her death, someone probably thought Mosetrid to erase her from history. Her images were chiseled out, her name defaced, her legacy buried under dust and denial. But Hatshepsut had already carved herself into eternity, beard and all, which brings us to a king who needed no disguise, just extravagant debts, endless indulgence, and enough scandals to bankrupt a nation. King George IV of the United Kingdom was known for his extravagant lifestyle, massive debts, and numerous mistresses. If excess were an art form, George IV would have been its Da Vinci. Before he was king, he was already infamous as the Prince Regenta man so wrapped in silk, scandal, and sherry that the public coined new adjectives just to insult him. He spent lavishly on palaces, clothes, banquets, and lovers. His debts ballooned to the millions, in modern currency, and Parliament had to bail him out repeatedly, like a bad gambler who happened to be wearing a crown. His personal style? Gaudy. His table manners? Non-existent. His waistline? Expanding at the speed of gossip. He built the royal pavilion in Brighton, a bizarre Indo-Chinese fever dream of domes, dragons, and mirrored excess. And while his private life rotted behind velvet curtains, he tried to project an image of refinement and dignity. It was like wrapping a scandal in brocade and hoping the public wouldn't notice the stench. He hated his wife, Caroline of Brunswick, and tried to keep her from attending his own coronation. The public, of course, loved Herend, despised him. By the time he died, bloated and barely functional, his reputation was that of a cautionary tale in royal indulgence. Next, meet a queen whose name became infamous for a quote she never said and a head she very much did lose. Queen Marie Antoinette of France was rumored to have said, "Let them eat cake," though there's no historical evidence she ever uttered those words. She did have a penchant for elaborate fashion. Marie Antoinette was born into privilege, married into opulence, and eventually became the face of everything wrong with the French monarchy. "Let them eat cake" was the most famous phrase never said. It wasn't hers, but it stuck, because it fit. She was Austrian, foreign, frivolous. A queen who played shepherdess in a faux rustic hamlet, while peasants in real fields starved under the weight of taxes. Her fashion was revolutionary in its own right, towering wigs with miniature ships perched on top, gowns that required engineering to wear, and a style so indulgent that her dresses alone could feed entire villages. She made extravagance look effortless, and that was precisely the problem. In the powdery image of Marie Antoinette, the people saw their suffering reflected in reverse. But she wasn't the monster history made her out to be. Isolated, politically sidelined, and thrust into a collapsing system she barely understood, Marie was more symptom than cause. Still, when the guillotine came, it made no such distinctions. She went to her death with surprising dignity, bowing to her executioner after stepping on his foot. From royal fabric to severed legacy, our next king ruled an empire and a bedroom overflowing with wives, children, and a calendar full of marriages. King Sobhuza II of Eswatini, Swaziland, had over 70 wives and more than 200 children during his exceptionally long reign. In the realm of royal excess, King Sobuza II didn't just dabble, he multiplied. When he died in 1982, he left behind over 200 children and more than 70 wives, effectively creating a genealogical web so sprawling it could have crashed census systems. But his legacy wasn't just numerical, it was also dynastic. Sobuza II ruled for 82 years, the longest confirmed reign of any monarch in recorded history. He became king as a baby, inherited a colonial reality, and lived long enough to see Eswatini emerge as an independent nation. His leadership combined tradition with pragmatism. While the outside world moved toward rapid modernization, Sobuza clung tightly to Swazi customs, most notably polygamy, ancestor veneration, and ritual ceremony. He abolished the country's constitution in 1973, suspended parliament, and declared himself absolute ruler. In the West, this would be tyranny. In Eswatini, it was couched in cultural preservation. Yet beneath the royal ceremony was a delicate balancing act. Sobuza maneuvered between colonial expectations, Cold War pressures, and internal demands for development, all while raising a family the size of a small nation. And now, from a king who hunted political survival through ritual, to an emperor who hunted with real weapon sand led from the front lines. Emperor Kangxi of China was an avid hunter and often personally led military campaigns demonstrating his physical prowess. Emperor Kangxi wasn't content to sit on a throne. He galloped into battle, bow in hand, body armored, leading from the front like a warrior lifted straight from legend. Ruling from 1661 to 1722, he reigned for 61 years, making him one of China's longest ruling emperors, and he used that time not to hide behind bureaucracy, but to reshape an empire with his own hands. From a young age, Kangxi trained in horseback riding and archery, arts essential to the Manchu identity. He wasn't just a hunter of tigers, was a hunter of threats. He led campaigns against rebellious generals, quelled revolts in the south, and pushed back foreign encroachments from Russia and Mongolia. He expanded China's borders while also stabilizing its institutions, promoting science, and embracing Jesuit scholars who brought Western astronomy and mathematics to court. Kangxi's power came not just from tradition but from charisma. He showed strength with style, whether riding through snow-covered forests or debating philosophy with French missionaries. His rule fused raw authority with cultivated intellect. And next, from a hunter-emperor to a warrior queenon who dared to stand against Rome itself, crown on head and sword in hand, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra challenged the Roman Empire, declaring independence and conquering vast territories before being defeated by Emperor Aurelian. Queen Zenobia wasn't just ruling a desert outpost, she was building an empire in the bones of another. After the death of her husband, King Odaenathus, she took control of Palmyra in the 3rd century CE and did what few dared. She stared down Rome. Not content to merely govern, Zenobia marched her armies across Egypt, Syria, and parts of Anatolia, carving out a domain that rivaled the empire that had once dismissed her as ornamental. Her ambition was wrapped in eloquence. Fluent in Aramaic, Greek, and Latin, she styled herself as the new Cleopatra only this time. The politics came with military precision. Coins were minted in her name. Edicts bore her signature. Rome called her a rebel. Palmyra called her a savior. But rebellion has a shelf life. Emperor Aurelian eventually pushed east, defeating her forces and capturing Zenobia herself. According to legend, she was paraded through Rome in golden chain humiliation by spectacle. Some say she lived out her days in comfort as a Roman matron. Others say she starved in captivity. Either way, she stood in the arena of power and dared to strike. Now, from the sword's edge to the king who loved, well, not queens, but one particular gentleman. King Edward II of England was notoriously fond of Piers Gaveston, a favourite whose influence angered the barons and ultimately led to Edward's deposition and likely murder. Edward II didn't just break the mold of English kingship, he shattered it, then handed the pieces to Piers Gaveston like a love note scrawled on royal parchment. From the moment Edward ascended the throne in 1307, he flaunted his preference for Gaveston, a handsome Gascon knight of modest origin whom he showered with titles, lands, and outrageously public affection. This wasn't just favoritism, it was obsession, and in medieval England that was dangerous. The barons loathed Gaveston, not just because of his arrogance or the king's naked partiality, but because power was slipping from noble hands into the velvet grip of a man they considered a foreign upstart and, possibly scandalously, the king's lover. The tension boiled over. Gaveston was exiled multiple times, then kidnapped and executed by the nobles. Edward's grief turned to fury, but the damage was done. He never recovered politically. His later years were marked by rebellion, betrayal, and eventual imprisonment. In 1327, Edward was deposed by his own wife, Isabella, and her lover, Roger Mortimer. His death remains a mystery rumored to involve a red-hot poker and poetic justice, though historians remain skeptical. From whispered bedrooms to clashing swords, our next queen wielded both passion and power, marrying kings and making crusades look like personal errands. Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine was one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages, marrying two kings, Louis VII of France and Henry II of England, and participating in a crusade. Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine lived like a heroine in a medieval epic, only with more lawsuits and sharper dialogue. Inheriting one of the richest duchies in Europe, she first married Louis VII of France and accompanied him on the Second Crusade, marching through scorching deserts in chainmail and scandalizing monks with her entourage of silk-clad warrior women. Her marriage to Louis was annulled allegedly because she failed to produce a male heir, more likely because she was smarter, bolder, and more politically savvy than he could stomach. Weeks later, she married Henry Plantagenet, the future Henry II of England, and gave birth to a dynasty. Among her sons, Richard the Lionheart and King John. That's right, she mothered both a chivalric icon and the villain of every Robin Hood film. But Eleanor didn't stop at motherhood. When her husband's tyranny became unbearable, she helped her sons rebel against him. He imprisoned her for over a decade. She outlived him. She was Queen of France, Queen of England, and ruler of Aquitaine in her own right. A crusader, diplomat, and legend with a pen as sharp as any sword. Now, from one royal family tree to another, this next king didn't just grow branches. He added a wife annually. King Mswati III of Eswatini annually chooses a new wife during the reed dance ceremony. If monarchy were a festival, King Mswati III would be its perennial master of ceremonies. Every year, thousands of young women gather for the Umlangaur Reed Dansea cultural event in Eswatini, where the king traditionally selects a new bride. The ceremony, framed by the monarchy as a celebration of purity and tradition, also functions as one of the most controversial dating rituals on the planet. Mswati III, the last absolute monarch in Africa, has accumulated over a dozen wives this way. The exact number fluctuates, as does the official record, continuing the polygamous legacy of his father, King Sobhuza II. While many citizens celebrate the cultural preservation, critics both local and international see it as exploitative, patriarchal, and deeply out of step with modern values. Meanwhile, Eswatini remains economically strained, with much of the population living in poverty. Yet, The royal family lives in luxury Swati's fleet of luxury cars, and private plane stands in stark contrast to his people's hardship. Calls for reform are growing louder. But for now, the dance continues, ritual cloaked in tradition, power cloaked in ceremony. Next, we leave royal polygamy for imperial modernization by a silent emperor who brought samurai into the age of steam. Emperor Meiji of Japan oversaw the rapid modernization and westernization of Japan, ending centuries of isolation. Before Emperor Meiji, Japan was a nation of wooden swords and closed doors. After him, it was a steel-forged empire humming with railroads, telegram wires, and constitutional drafts. Born in 1852 and ascending the throne in 1867, Emperor Meiji was the quiet force behind one of the most astonishing national transformations in history, the Meiji Restoration. The samurai shaved their top knots, factories replaced feudal farms, Shinto mixed with steam engines. Though often depicted as a passive figurehead, Meiji's reign wasn't passive at all. He became the symbolic fulcrum upon which Japan pivoted from isolation to imperial ambition. Under his watch, the Tokugawa shogunate was abolished, a Western-style military was formed, and foreign advisors were brought in to rewire the nation's institutions. Within a generation, Japan went from being a secluded archipelago to defeating the Russian Empire in a seismic moment that stunned the West. And yet, Meiji himself was elusive. Few heard his voice. He lived in semi-sacred seclusion, even as his ministers crafted bullet trains for the future. A living paradox, a divine emperor driving industrial revolution. Now, from modern warlords to ancient resistance next, we meet a queen who fought Rome not with diplomacy, but with fire and vengeance. Queen Boudica of the Iceni led a major revolt against Roman rule in Britain, burning several Roman towns to the ground. Queen Boudica didn't lead an army, she led a reckoning. In the 1st century CE, after her husband's death, the Roman Empire annexed her kingdom, flogged her, and raped her daughters. Rome expected compliance. What they got instead was a Celtic inferno. Boudica, tall and flame-haired, mounted a war chariot and launched a rebellion that scorched southern Britain. Her army, said to number in the tens of thousands, razed Roman settlements with the fury of retribution. Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester, Londinium, London, and Verulamium, St. Albans, were burned to ash. Roman legions were slaughtered. Temples toppled. Governors fled. It was a brief, brutal inversion of empire. But Rome retaliated methodically. Governor Suetonius regrouped, ambushed Boudica's forces, and crushed the rebellion in a pitched battle. Outnumbered and cornered, Boudica either took poison or died of illness. Accounts differ. Her revolt failed, but her legend survived, revived centuries later as a symbol of nationalist resistance and female strength. Statues were built, streets named. Her rage became myth. And now, from a warrior queen to a catatonic king whose silences were so profound, his wife had to speak for the throne. King Henry VI of England suffered from periods of catatonia, during which he was completely unresponsive, making his wife, Margaret of Anjou, a de facto ruler. King Henry VI didn't roar or rage, he vanished. At intervals throughout his reign, the English king would fall into deep, impenetrable catatonia, unresponsive for months at a time. He wouldn't speak, move, or recognize those around him. In a world where royal authority meant military strength and sharp decision-making, Henry's mind simply evacuated. Born during the 100 Years' War and crowned king of both England and France as a child, Henry was utterly unsuited for either role. Devout, bookish, and painfully passive, he preferred prayer to politics. His inability to lead left a vacuum that his formidable wife, Margaret of Anjou, filled with steely resolve. Margaret became the real monarch in all but name-rallying troops, crushing opposition and sparking fear in those who underestimated her. But England's patience wore thin. Henry's episodes grew longer, the realm more fractured. The Wars of the Roses erupted two branches of the royal family, tearing the country apart in a generational blood feud. Henry was captured, restored, and recaptured. Eventually, he died likely murdered during another bout of helpless silence. From the battlefield to the monastery, his reign was a tragedy in slow motion. And now, from one mind lost in fog to another that lit up Salonsor, next queen was a philosopher first, monarch second. Queen Sophie Charlotte of Prussia was a keen philosopher and corresponded with Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. In the high towers of Prussian royalty, Queen Sophie Charlotte stood apart not for her jewels or titles, but for the company she kept and the questions she asked. She wasn't just a queen, she was an intellectual force, a salon host whose most notable pen pal was none other than the polymath Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. While her husband, Frederick I, over crowns and court pageantry, Sophie Charlotte debated metaphysics and the nature of the soul over tea. Her court in Charlottenburg, named in her honor, became a hub of Enlightenment thinking. She surrounded herself with scientists, poets, philosophers, and thinkers, transforming stiff Prussian politics into lively philosophical inquiry. She was fluent in multiple languages, devoured books, and had little patience for the ornamental role assigned to queens. Leibniz, a man known for developing calculus and contemplating theodicy, admired her mind deeply. Their correspondence reveals a queen who questioned fate, the divine, and the structure of the universe with the ease of someone discussing flower arrangements. But philosophy doesn't protect from mortality. Sophie Charlotte died young, at 36, of pneumonia. Yet her legacy endures not just in buildings and letters, but in the rare idea of a queen who ruled from the mind outward. No, from a queen of reason to the first king of a cold, northern land buried in a ship and wrapped in legend. King Gorm the Old of Denmark was the first historically recognized king of Denmark and is buried in a famous ship setting. Before there were Vikings on Netflix, there was Gorm, the old Denmark's foundational monarch, the man who dragged the Norse chieftains towards something resembling a kingdom. Reigning in the 10th century, Gorm is the earliest Danish king confirmed by historical records, and the beginning of what would become one of Europe's oldest continuous monarchies. His reign, by medieval standards, was relatively uneventful. No massive conquests or religious revolutions, but he did one thing exceptionally well. He laid the groundwork. He consolidated territory, asserted dynastic legitimacy, and most famously, buried his wife, Thyra, in a massive burial mound in Jelling, the site now known as the birth certificate of Denmark. Gorm himself was later buried there, under a stone ship setting symbolizing a vessel for the afterlife, as per Viking tradition. His son, Harald Bluetooth, would later raise the famous Jelling stones in their honor, inscribing the runes that declared Denmark's Christianization and unification. Gorm's bones were rediscovered in the 20th century, moved multiple times, and debated by archaeologists like a royal Rubik's Cube. But his status as Denmark's old king remains ironically fresh. Next, from Norse beginnings to Norwegian glamour, we meet a queen who brought skiing and silk to the throne. Queen Maud of Norway was a British princess who became Queen of Norway. She was known for her elegant fashion sense and love of skiing. Queen Maud of Norway was the royal equivalent of a winter postcard. Elegance, snow, and a lot of understated rebellion. Born a British princess, the daughter of King Edward VII, and granddaughter of Queen Victoria, married Prince Karl of Denmark, who later became King Haakon VII of newly independent Norway. Thus, Maud transformed from Windsor spare part to Scandinavian-style icon. While her British roots never left her, she continued importing her clothes from London. Maud embraced Norway with surprising enthusiasm. She promoted Norwegian art, charities, and perhaps most famously skiing. At a time when royalty was expected to wave from balconies, she was gliding down frosty slopes in ankle-length skirts and a tailored coat, combining aristocracy with athleticism. Her fashion sense was impeccable, favoring sleek, minimalist lines decades before that was a thing. She became a symbol of modern monarchic but approachable, ceremonial but grounded. Yet she never lost her Englishness. She spoke Norwegian with a crisp accent, kept her British staff close, and occasionally acted more like a royal ambassador than a native queen. She died suddenly in 1938 during a routine trip to London, leaving behind a Norway just beginning to find its post-independence voice. Next, from snowy hills to muddy fieldsway, follow a king who met his end in a swamp, chased by fate and Hungarian defeat. King Louis II of Hungary and Bohemia drowned in a marsh after falling off his horse during the Battle of Mohacs, leading to the partition of his kingdoms. Few monarchs have exited the world quite as literally face-first as King Louis II. At just 20 years old, the young ruler of Hungary and Bohemia galloped into the Battle of Mohacs in 1526 against the formidable Ottoman Empire. His army was disorganized, his leadership rushed, and his youth tragically untempered by caution. The battle was an unmitigated disaster. Hungary's noble elite was slaughtered, and the Ottomans overran the field within hours. As the defeat turned into a rout, Louis attempted to flee. His horse either stumbled or panicked, throwing the king into a marshy stream swollen by recent rains. Weighed down by armor, and likely in a panic, Louis drowned unceremoniously, anonymously, as if the land itself swallowed him out of pity. His death was more than personal tragedy. It was political collapse. With no heir and no plan, Hungary was carved into three parts: Ottoman, occupied territory; Habsburg, controlled land; and a semi-autonomous Transylvania. His body wasn't found until days later. In a single battle and a single stumble, a kingdom crumbled. From drowning kings we now ascend to a queen, crowned not as queen, but as king, because the throne, apparently, had no room for femininity. Queen Jadwiga of Poland was one of the few female monarchs crowned King of Poland, highlighting her full sovereign authority. In 1384, a 12-year-old girl became king, not Queen King. Jadwiga of Poland wasn't being misgendered. She was being politically rebranded. Poland's nobles made a conscious choice to crown her with the masculine title to leave no doubt. She was not a consort, not a regent, but the sovereign ruler of the realm. And so, Jadwiga ascended the throne not as a bride-in-waiting, but as a monarch with a scepter and agenda. Despite her youth, she wielded power with a blend of piety, diplomacy, and sharp intelligence. She orchestrated the union of Poland and Lithuania by marrying Grand Duke Jogaila, who converted to Christianity and became King Władysław II Jagiellonis. This alliance would reshape Eastern Europe and lay the foundations for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Jadwiga wasn't just a political pawn. She funded churches, supported universities, most notably Krakow W's, later named Jagiellonian University, and was beloved for her charitable work. She died young, in childbirth, but her legend endured. Canonized by the Catholic Church centuries later, she became a saint of scholarship and statecraft. And now, from holy rule to haunted routine, we meet an emperor whose life was so rigid it could be told by a clock, even as everything he loved fell to pieces. Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria-Hungary had a famously rigid daily routine and rarely deviated from it, even after the deaths of his wife and son. If punctuality were power, Emperor Franz Joseph I would have ruled the world. For over 6 decades, he governed the sprawling, crumbling empire of Austria-Hungary with a sense of clockwork ritual that bordered on monastic. He woke at precisely 4 a.m., wrote government documents by hand, and shaved himself daily without fail. His life was a study in imperial self-discipline. He ruled as if personal order could counterbalance national chaos. But tragedy chipped away at his steel-plated schedule. His beloved wife, Empress Elizabeth, Sisi, was assassinated by an anarchist in Geneva. His only son and heir, Crown Prince Rudolf, died in what was likely a murder-suicide pact at Mayerling with his mistress. Franz Joseph never fully recovered, emotionally or politically, but he never changed his habits. Even in the face of world-shifting grief, he adhered to the same timetable, the same routines, the same solitary breakfasts. He ruled through revolutions, wars, and the slow dissolution of empire. By the time of his death in 1916, the empire was a hollow shell, stitched together by protocol and denial. Next, we meet a king who reshaped his very name, and his dynasty's stow survived the onslaught of public fury during a world at war. King George V of the United Kingdom renamed the British royal house from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to Windsor during WWI due to anti-German sentiment. In 1917, King George V pulled off one of the greatest royal rebrands in history, not with a logo, but with a surname. As World War I raged and anti-German sentiment burned through British streets like wildfire, the royal family found itself in an awkward position. Their name, Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, sounded more Kaiser than king. And with German bombs falling from the sky delivered by a plane named the Gotha G, forth the British monarchy urgently needed to sound less German. George V, a man of discipline and naval precision, responded not with rhetoric but with scissors. He cut ties with centuries of German lineage and declared that his dynasty would henceforth be known as the House of Windsor, name as solid, English, and castle-like as possible. It was symbolic, yes, but also shrewd. Public opinion softened. The monarchy survived the war. Behind the stiff mustache and military uniforms, George was a quiet reformer. He knew when to bend to survive. The royal family as PR firm, it began with him. And now we turn to a queen who mourned her husband for 40 years straight, wearing black, not just for love, but for permanence. Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands famously wore a black armband for 40 years after the death of her husband, Prince Hendrik. Some monarchs grieve in silence. Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands wore her grief like a uniform. After the death of her husband, Prince Hendrik, in 1934, she donned a black armband and never took it off. For 40 years, through war, exile, occupation, and abdication, that band of mourning clung to her sleeve like a personal manifesto, love, loss, and a refusal to move on. Wilhelmina wasn't just a widow. She was a war queen. During World War II, she refused to flee quietly. When the Nazis occupied the Netherlands, she escaped to London and became the voice of resistance, broadcasting radio messages back to her occupied homeland, rallying her people with steel-edged dignity. Churchill called her the only man in the Dutch government. She ruled for 50 years and abdicated in 1948, partly from exhaustion, partly from a belief that monarchy needed new energy. Yet even in retirement, the black armband remained. It became her personal symbol, not of weakness, but of loyalty to something no longer present. From a queen of stoic memory to a king of scientific curiosity next, we meet the monarch who hired tutors, learned Latin, and used trigonometry to modernize Siam and inspire a Broadway musical. King Mongkut of Siam, Thailand, as depicted in The King and I, though fictionalized, was a progressive monarch who embraced Western science and languages. Forget the dancing king of The King, and I, the real King Mongkut of Siam, was more astronomer than showman. Before becoming monarch in 1851, he spent nearly 3 decades as a Buddhist monk, during which time he studied Latin, English, and science with missionaries and Western scholars. He didn't just tolerate foreign ideas, he sought them out, dissected them, and used them to fortify Siam against colonial encroachment. Once on the throne, Mongkut began modernizing his kingdom, not through conquest, but through calculated diplomacy. He negotiated treaties with Britain, France, and the United States, playing imperial powers against each other like a well-versed gambler in silk robes. He introduced modern education, reformed the legal code, and championed astronomy famously, predicting a solar eclipse in 1868 with pinpoint accuracy, a feat that stunned Western scientists. But the romanticized tale of Anna Leonowens and her relationship with the king? Largely fictional. Mongkut didn't dance to Shall We Dance, he strategized with star charts. He died shortly after witnessing the eclipse he had predicted, succumbing to malaria. But his son, Chulalongkorn, would continue his work, ensuring Siam remained one of the few Asian nations never colonized. Next, from telescopes to throne room sway, now turn to the last emperor of a fading empire, whose crown ended up in a museum, and whose life was rewritten by every regime that followed. Emperor Puyi of China, the last emperor, led a complex life, including being a puppet ruler for the Japanese and later a gardener in communist China. Puyi was crowned Emperor of China at age 2. He wept through his coronation, too young to understand that the dragon throne was already broken. The Qing dynasty collapsed just 3 years later, leaving him a boy king without a kingdom, wandering the halls of the Forbidden City like a ghost of empires past. Even after abdication, he lived within the palace walls under special arrangements, cut off from the real world but still surrounded by eunuchs, concubines, and imperial ritualan emperor in name, not in power. Later, the Japanese found a use for him. In the 30s, they installed him as the puppet emperor of Manchukuo, their manufactured state in northeastern China. There, Puyi reigned again, but as a figurehead controlled by Tokyo. He signed laws he didn't write, ruled people he never met, and watched as his supposed empire was used to justify occupation and exploitation. After World War II, Puyi was captured by the Soviets, handed over to communist China, and shockingly not executed. Instead, he was re-educated. By the 60s, the last emperor of China was working as a gardener in Beijing, trimming hedges near the palace he once ruled. From throne to dirt, god to gardener. Now, meet a queen with a wolfish appetite for revenge who turned marriage into a blade. Queen Isabella of France, the she-wolf of France, overthrew her husband, King Edward II, with her lover Roger Mortimer. They called her the she-wolf of France, but Isabella of England was far more precise than that label implies. Daughter of the French king, married to England's Edward II, Isabella lived in the shadows of humiliation. Her husband favored his male companions, most infamously Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser, lavishing them with titles and influence while she was sidelined, ignored, and publicly disrespected. But Isabella played the long game. Sent to France in 1325 for diplomatic negotiations, she refused to return. There, she met Roger Mortimer, a disgraced English lord turned fugitive, and together they became both lovers and co-conspirators. In 1326, they launched an invasion of England, raising an army and storming London with little resistance. Edward II was captured, deposed, and likely murdered soon after. For 4 years, Isabella and Mortimer effectively ruled England through her underage son, Edward III. They reveled in power until Edward III came of age, turned on them, and had Mortimer executed. Isabella was spared, exiled to luxurious confinement. History remembers her as ruthless, but behind the wolf's snarl was a queen who seized control in a world built to silence her. Next, we meet a king who didn't just love God, he tried to weaponize him with a navy and a monastic palace. King Philip II of Spain was a devout Catholic and built the immense El Escorial Palace Monastery Mausoleum. He also tried to invade England with the Spanish Armada. If medieval kings built castles to intimidate, King Philip II of Spain built a stone sermon. El Escorial wasn't just a palace, it was a cold, sprawling architectural manifesto. Part monastery, part royal court, and part tomb, the granite fortress housed monks, relics, and the bones of his ancestors in carefully organized drawers. It had the spiritual subtlety of a cathedral and the emotional warmth of a morgue. Philip, ever devout and ever grim, found comfort in its solemn geometry. His Catholicism wasn't just personal, it was national policy. He saw himself as the sword arm of the Counter-Reformation, heresy, a cancer to be burned out. And Protestant England was a tumor at the heart of Europe. So, in 1588, he launched the Spanish Armada, a vast fleet intended to crush Elizabeth I and return the island to the Pope's fold. God, however, preferred wind. The Armada was scattered, battered, and defeated by storms and strategy alike. Philip never recovered from the humiliation. He spent his remaining years poring over papers, locked in El Escorial, buried in bureaucracy and prayer. He died surrounded by relics, convinced of his righteousness. Now, from Catholic excess to royal madness, we shift to a queen who mourned her dead husband by sleeping beside his rotting corpse, Queen Joanna of Castile. Joanna the Mad suffered from extreme melancholy and was confined for much of her life. She famously kept her husband's corpse unburied for years. Joanna of Castile didn't lose her mind all at once. It unraveled, stitch by royal stitch. Born into the powerful Spanish Habsburg dynasty, Joanna was wed to Philip, the Handsome of Burgundy, a man whose charm was matched only by his infidelity. She loved him fiercely, obsessively, perhaps too much. When he died unexpectedly in 1506, something inside her shattered. Refusing to accept his death, she ordered his coffin to be kept open so she could gaze upon his body. She reportedly traveled with it from town to town, stopping at monasteries where she insisted no other women be present. The dead do not betray, and Philippe no longer philandering was finally hers alone. Joanna's grief, combined with political inconvenience, led to her being declared insane by her father, Ferdinand, and later confined by her son, Charles V. She spent the last 50 years of her life in a stone cell in Tordesillas, her mind clouded, her title meaningless. History dubbed her La Loca. Joanna the Mad, but madness can be a useful label when inconvenient queens refuse to disappear. What's more unsettling, her descent into grief, or the family that buried her alive? Now to a king who traded mourning veils for sailing flags because the sea was the only crown he couldn't outpace. King Harald V of Norway is an avid sailor and has competed in numerous international sailing championships. King Harald V doesn't just sit on a throne, he sails past them. Unlike many monarchs, whose hobbies are ceremonial golf swings and the occasional photo op, Harald took his love of sailing to Olympic levels literally. He competed in 3 Olympic Games, beginning in 1964, and continued racing in world championships well into his reign. Even as king, he preferred a rudder in hand to a scepter. His yacht, Fram XVI, became his second palace. In 2005, he even captained the Norwegian team to victory in the World Sailing Championships in Portugal, beating younger full-time athletes in a sport that demands brutal focus and physical precision. Not bad for a man whose head appears on currency. His maritime passion reflects his reign, steady, unpretentious, and quietly admirable. Unlike louder monarchs who govern through spectacle, Harald has led Norway with a soft-spoken consistency that's earned genuine respect. He's known for dry wit, emotional sincerity, and the rare ability to make monarchy feel human. Sailing, after all, is about reading the wind, trusting your instincts, and riding through storms with balance. Which leads us perfectly to the next queen who stood calm and composed while bombs rained over her kingdom and history reshaped itself in fire. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, was known for her resilience during WWI, refusing to leave London during the Blitz. She lived to be 101. When bombs fell over London during the Blitz, Queen Elizabeth, later known as the Queen Mother, did not flee to the countryside or to Canada, as was suggested. Instead, she and King George VI stayed in Buckingham Palace, even after it was bombed. "I'm glad we've been bombed," she famously said. "It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." In that moment, she transformed from royal figurehead to national icon, resilient, composed, unshaken. Her role during WWII went far beyond symbolic. She visited bombed-out neighborhoods, hospitals, and factories, boosting morale with a calm gaze and tailored coat. She became a mother not just to the future Queen Elizabeth II, but to a battered and embattled nation. Nazi propaganda called her the most dangerous woman in Europe, precisely because she refused to abandon her people. And she endured. After her husband's death in 1952, she became the Queen Mother, maintaining an active public presence for another half-century. She died in 2002 at the age of 101, having outlived 2 world wars, 4 monarchs, and a century of history. Next, from steadfast queens to a king who built his legacy not in palaces but in bricks, arches, and a round astronomical tower, King Christian IV of Denmark and Norway was an enthusiastic builder, commissioning many notable buildings in Copenhagen, including the Round Tower. King Christian IV didn't just reign renovated. One of Denmark's most flamboyant and enduring monarchs, he ruled from 1588 to 1648 and left his architectural thumbprint all over Copenhagen. The Round Tower, Rundetårn, an observatory still standing today, is one of his most famous contributions, a spiral ramp leading to the heavens, built for stargazing and intellectual pursuit, not war. But the Round Tower was just the beginning. Christian IV initiated a building boom that transformed Denmark's capital into a Renaissance showcase. Rosenborg Castle, the stock exchange with its iconic dragon spire, and Christiansborg Palace, though later iterations burned and were rebuilt, all bore his royal signature. He was obsessed with visibility. If power couldn't be eternal, it could at least be built in stone. Unfortunately, his reign was also marked by disastrous wars, including the 30 Years' War, which drained the treasury and devastated morale. His legacy became one of contrast. Brilliant builder, but overreaching strategist. He designed for posterity, but governed for spectacle. Still, his buildings remain weathered, repurposed, and admired centuries later. And now, from stone ships to actual ones next, we travel back to the Summer Palace of China, where one empress used navy funds to build something far less seaworthy, Empress Cixi of China reportedly spent lavishly on an elaborate marble boat for her summer palace, diverting funds intended for the Navy. When the Chinese Navy needed warships, Empress Dowager Cixi gave them a marble yacht. Floating uselessly on the waters of the summer palace, the massive structure was more metaphor than maritime. Built in 1755 and later renovated under her orders in the 1880s, the boat symbolized imperial decadence at a moment when China was crumbling under foreign aggression and internal rot. CZ ruled from behind, a curtain literally manipulating young emperors and sidestepping official titles. She was brilliant, manipulative, ruthless, and often misunderstood. But her decision to redirect naval funds to beautify her private retreat became the ultimate symbol of Qing dysfunction. While Japan modernized its fleet and Western powers sliced China into concessions, the empire floated serenely into irrelevance in a boat that couldn't move. The irony is tragic. After China's humiliating defeat in the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894-1895, critics pointed to Cixi's marble folly as proof of court corruption. And yet, she remained in power until her death, in 1908, unapologetic, unmovable, a queen of still water in a time of storms. Next, we turn to a French king who chased pleasure, scandal, and beauty-all, while his kingdom simmered toward revolution. King Louis XV of France was known for his numerous mistresses, most famously Madame de Pompadour and Madame du Barry, who wielded considerable political influence. Louis XV inherited France's throne at the age of 5 and ruled for nearly 6 decades long, enough to charm, disappoint, and scandalize an entire nation. Once dubbed Louis the Well-Beloved, he managed to reverse that sentiment with a lifetime of court intrigue, mismanagement, and romantic entanglements that made Versailles feel more like a brothel with chandeliers. His most famous mistresses weren't just bedroom companions, they were cultural and political forces. Madame de Pompadour was more than a pretty face. She was an intellectual, a patron of the arts, and a strategist who effectively became a minister in all but title. She hosted salons, influenced foreign policy, and championed Enlightenment thinker Voltaire. Her successor, Madame du Barry, was less intellectual and more ornamental, but her presence still drove factions at court into hysterical infighting. These women were hated and envied in equal measure, blamed for France's stagnation and spending. But the real culprit was Louis himself, a monarch more interested in opulence than governance. As the people starved, Versailles glittered. His reign became a warning of what happens when power curls inward and dies of boredom. Now, from French mistresses to English betrayal next, we meet the queen who lost her head for a crime she may never have committed. Queen Anne Boleyn of England was executed for treason, though many historians believe she was innocent and framed by her husband, Henry VIII. Anne Boleyn's rise was theatrical, her fall, pure tragedy. She captivated Henry VIII with her sharp wit, refusal to submit, and dark, unconventional beauty. For years, she dangled possibility in front of the king, withholding marriage and intimacy until she wore a crown. When she finally became queen, she was pregnant, resented, and already hunted. Anne gave birth not to the male heir Henry so desperately wanted, but to a daughter Elizabeth, who would later become England's greatest monarch. Yet in Anne's moment, this was failure. Court enemies circled. Her inability to produce a son, combined with her reformist religious views and assertive personality, made her vulnerable. Conveniently, Henry had already fallen for Jane Seymour. In 1536, Anne was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and plotting the king's death. The accusations were absurdly flimsy. The trial, a farce, but it didn't matter. She was executed within weeks, beheaded by a French swordsman specially summoned for the task. Her final words were dignified, even gracious. Anne died a queen without a son, but gave birth to a dynasty. And now, from fabricated power to philosophical humility, we meet a king who ordered the tide to recede just to prove he couldn't control it. King Canute, the Great of England, Denmark, and Norway famously ordered the tide to turn back to demonstrate that even kings are not above God's will. The story of King Canute and the tide is one of the most enduring and most misunderstood tales in royal history. Often told as an example of royal arrogance, the truth is far more ironic and far more human. Canute wasn't delusional. He was devout. He staged the scene as a public lesson. Even a king cannot command nature, because only God holds ultimate authority. Canute, who ruled a North Sea empire spanning England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden in the early 11th century, was no fool. He was a conqueror, a shrewd statesman, and one of the few Viking-era rulers who successfully merged brutality with bureaucracy. But he also understood the danger of flattery. Surrounded by sycophants, he decided to demonstrate the limits of monarchy by sitting on a throne by the seashore and commanding the tide to halt. Of course, the water kept coming. Canute let his feet get soaked to make the point. The king is not divine. This quiet performance is echoed for 1,000 years, reminding ruler Sand the ruled of the illusion of control. Next, we drift into a different kind of illusion, the empress who rewrote fashion, diplomacy, and destiny in the glittering shadow of Napoleon III. Empress Eugénie de Montijo of France, wife of Napoleon III, was a fashion icon and played a significant role in the opening of the Suez Canal. If Versailles had a final curtain call before falling into modernity, it was Empress Eugénie. The Spanish-born wife of Napoleon III was part queen, part celebrity, and entirely a creature of spectacle. Her influence extended from haute couture to geopolitics, shaping not only the fashion of the French court but also the course of international diplomacy. Under Eugénie's watch, the crinoline skirt became a symbol of empire, and her collaborations with designer Charles Worth helped establish Paris as the fashion capital of the world. But beneath the silk and satin was a woman deeply involved in statecraft and advisor to her husband, and at times a forceful political voice. She lobbied for conservative Catholic causes, hosted heads of state, and was instrumental in supporting the completion of the Suez Canal, which opened in 1869 with her as guest of honor. But fashion couldn't save a crumbling regime. After France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, the Second Empire collapsed, and Eugénie fled to exile in England. She outlived her husband and only son, eventually dying in 1920, an empress without an empire, but with an enduring legacy. Next, from fashion to fornication, we sail into the scandalous private life of a king whose mistresses made more headlines than his policies. King Edward VII of the United Kingdom was a notorious womanizer and bon vivant before becoming king, leading a scandalous private life. Before he wore the crown, Edward VII was the Prince of Wales and the tabloid headline of his generation. Known as Bertie to his family, Edward was a walking contradiction, heir to Queen Victoria's strict moral code, yet the embodiment of its every violation. His escapades filled gossip columns and strained the royal image as he dashed from Parisian brothels to dinner parties, smoking cigars and seducing aristocrats along the way. His mother despaired of him. She blamed him for the death of his father, Prince Albert, who had fallen ill shortly after reprimanding Edward for one of his romantic indiscretions. The incident shadowed Edward for years, yet didn't stop his indulgences. Married to Princess Alexandra, he carried on numerous affairs with actresses, duchesses, and even courtesans, most famously Lily Langtry and Alice Keppel, who happened to be the great-grandmother of Camilla, queen consort today. Despite this, when he finally became king in 1901, Edward VII surprised everyone. He was competent, diplomatic, and popular a monarch who helped modernize the monarchy's image. He reigned for just 9 years, but left behind a legacy of paradox, a rake who ruled respectably. And next, we rewind to ancient Legentu, a queen who outsmarted an empire using nothing but wit, ox, hide, and ambition. Queen Dido of Carthage, a legendary Phoenician queen, is said to have founded Carthage by buying as much land as could be covered by an ox hide, then cutting the hide into thin strips to encompass a large area. Dido, also known as Alyssa, was the mythic matriarch of Carthage, and her story is the kind of origin myth that blends cunning, tragedy, and foundational glory. Fleeing her murderous brother in Tyre, she arrived on the North African coast seeking refuge and leverage. When the local Berber ruler told her she could have only as much land as could be covered by an ox hide, Dido didn't argue. She dissected the hide into impossibly thin strips, forming a perimeter large enough to enclose the hill of Byrsa, where she founded Carthage. This is not just legend, it's branding. Dido's clever maneuver turned her into a symbol of political ingenuity and female authority. Under her, Carthage didn't just rise, it sparkled. A trade hub, a naval power, a future thorn in Rome's side. But her end is as dramatic as her beginning. According to Virgil's Aeneid, Dido fell in love with the Trojan hero Aeneas, and when he abandoned her to fulfill his destiny in Italy, she committed suicide atop a burning pyre-cursing Rome in her dying breath. A queen of cleverness and curses. Next, we meet a king who traded blades for abolition, reshaping his country's soul one decree at a time. King Chulalongkorn of Siam, Thailand, abolished slavery in Thailand and implemented numerous reforms to modernize the country. King Chulalongkorn, also known as Rama V, didn't just sit on a throne, he used it as a lever to pry Thailand into the modern world. Ascending to power in 1868, he inherited a country balanced precariously between independence and colonization. The British were eyeing Burma. The French were circling Indochina. The solution? Out-modernize the colonizers. Chulalongkorn's reign was defined by reform. He abolished slavery not by sudden decree, but by gradual legal dismantling, ensuring economic and social stability. Children born to slaves were declared free, and laws were introduced to prevent debt bondage. This slow, strategic abolition earned him the reverent title Phra Phya Maharaj, the beloved great king. But he didn't stop at slavery. Chulalongkorn reorganized the government, introduced Western-style education, revamped the legal system, and built a national railway. He sent his sons to study in Europe, adopted Western court dress, and even installed modern sewage systems. Unlike so many rulers who resisted change and lost their crowns, Chulalongkorn embraced it and preserved Siam's independence. By the time he died in 1910, Thailand was one of the only Southeast Asian nations never colonized. Next, we cross to the east once more, this time to the architect emperor who codified Roman law and commissioned a church that touched the sky. Emperor Justinian I of Byzantium oversaw the construction of the Hagia Sophia and the codification of Roman law, the Corpus Juris Civilis. If Constantine founded Constantinople, then Justinian gilded it. Ruling from 527 to 565, Justinian I dreamed of reviving the Roman Empire, and in many ways, he almost did. Under his reign, Byzantine generals reclaimed parts of North Africa, Italy, and Spain. But Justinian's legacy isn't just drawn on ancient maps, it's etched into stone and law. First, the Hagia Sophia. after riots in 532 burned much of the city, including the original church, Justinian didn't rebuild it. He transcended it. The Hagia Sophia rose from the ashes like a dome-wrapped miracle, 180 feet high, with a floating ceiling that defied gravity and belief alike. For nearly 1,000 years, it was the largest cathedral in the world, theological thunderclap turned architectural feat. Then came the Corpus Juris Civilis Justinian's codification of centuries of Roman law. It wasn't just a legal filing system, it became the backbone of modern Western jurisprudence. Even today, echoes of it persist in civil law traditions around the world. He ruled like a man racing time, trying to freeze Rome's glory before it vanished, and in a way, he succeeded. Now, from builders of empires to saviors of lives, we turn to a queen who begged for mercy on her knees and rewrote the ending of a siege. Queen Philippa of Hanno, wife of Edward III of England, was renowned for her compassion and successfully pleaded for the lives of the burghers of Calais. During the brutal 100 Years' War, Queen Philippa of Hanno etched her name into history not with a sword, but with a plea. In 1347, after a grueling siege of Calais, the city surrendered to the English. King Edward III, eager to make a statement, demanded that 6 of the city's leading citizens, the burghers, walk out barefoot and roped, offering their lives in submission. The message, "Defiance will be punished with death." They complied. Starving, gaunt, and silent, they approached their execution. And then, Philippa intervened. Heavily pregnant and moved by their courage, the queen fell to her knees before the king and begged for mercy. Her words were recorded not just as royal persuasion, but as maternal instinct elevated to diplomacy. "Let not the fruit of my womb be stained with blood," she implored. Edward relented, and the burghers lived. Philippa's act became legend. While her husband waged wars across Europe, she remained his moral ballast. She supported the arts, advised on policy, and proved that queens could be both gentle and politically decisive. From a queen's mercy to a king's muddy grave next, we unearth the last Plantagenet monarch whose bones were found not in a palace, but beneath a parking lot. King Richard III of England, whose skeleton was found under a car park, was the last Plantagenet king and died at the Battle of Bosworth Field. For centuries, Richard III was less man than Mython, alleged hunchback villain popularized by Shakespeare, the conniving uncle who usurped the throne and possibly murdered his nephews, the princes in the Tower. But in 2012, his bones came roaring back to life. Quite literally. Archaeologists in Leicester found his remains buried under a nondescript parking lot, wedged between yellow lines and forgotten modernity. Suddenly, the caricature had a skeleton. He was the last king of the House of York and the final ruler from the Plantagenet dynasty. His reign lasted just over 2 years, ending in 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth Field. It was there that Henry Tudor defeated him, taking the crown and launching the Tudor Dynastia PR-savvy regime that immediately got to work rewriting Richard's story. Shakespeare's crookback portrayal was the icing on the reputational coffin. But the real Richard was more complex. A capable military leader, an able administrator, and a man whose loyalty to his family may have cost him the crown. His rediscovered remains showed severe battle wounds and a curved spine, offering truth and myth in equal measure. And now, from bones in a car park to swans in a kingdom, we glide toward a queen who reigned longer than any British monarch and who technically owned every unmarked mute swan in the country. Queen Elizabeth II of the United Kingdom was the longest reigning British monarch and owned a special type of swan, which are still considered property of the crown. Queen Elizabeth II was many things: the anchor of a post-imperial monarchy, the face on stamps and currency, a woman who met 15 British prime ministers and more than 100 heads of state. But among the more bizarre footnotes of her 70-year reign was this. She legally owned all unmarked mute swans in open waters across England and Wales. It wasn't just symbolic. Each year, royal officials perform swan upping, a centuries-old census of the swan population on the River Thames. The birds are caught, checked, and if necessary tagged, all in the Queen's name. In a world of constitutional gray areas and fading empires, the fact that Elizabeth II owned swans, sturgeon, and dolphins in British waters was a reminder that monarchy still swims in deep historical waters. Her reign stretched from Churchill to TikTok. Through wars, scandals, jubilees, and pandemics, she endured with an inscrutable poker face and a handbag always just so. She was never meant to be queen until fate and her uncle's abdication made it so. Now, from royal longevity to biblical drama, travel back to the shepherd boy who became a king, slew a giant, played a harp, and sent a man to die for his lover. King David of Israel, according to biblical accounts, started as a shepherd and musician before becoming king, and was known for his affair with Bathsheba. David, the archetypal underdog turned king, is remembered for a slingshot, a harp, a crown, and a series of deeply human, deeply flawed decisions. Before he wore royal robes, David was a shepherd with a knack for music and a talent for battle. He played for King Saul, slayed Goliath, and earned the hearts of Israel. Charismatic, brave, and chosen by God, or so the scripture says. But divinely anointed doesn't mean morally perfect. His affair with Bathsheba is a case study in biblical scandal. He saw her bathing on a rooftop, summoned her to his chambers, and slept with her, despite her being married. When she became pregnant, David attempted to cover it up, and when that failed, he arranged for her husband, Uriah the Hittite, to be killed in battle. It was a cold, calculated move made by a man drunk on power, yet the Bible doesn't skip the consequences. David's life after the affair is marked by turmoil, family betrayal, political upheaval, and personal grief. His story is complex: warrior and poet, ruler and sinner, legend and cautionary tale. And next, we meet a queen whose bloodline carried both majesty and mutation, spreading a deadly genetic curse across Europe's royal houses. Queen Victoria Eugenia of Spain, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, also carried the gene for hemophilia, which she passed to her descendants in the Spanish royal family. Queen Victoria Eugenia of Spain didn't just bring royal lineage from Britain, she brought a genetic time bomb. As a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, she carried the gene for hemophilia, the royal disease that would ripple through European dynasties with surgical cruelty. When she married King Alfonso XIII of Spain in 1906, the match was meant to secure alliances and reinforce monarchy. Instead, it sowed internal ruin. Their wedding day was marked by Khayysan anarchist threw a bomb at their carriage, barely missing them. That ominous beginning set the tone. Victoria Eugenia bore 6 children, and 2 of her sons inherited hemophilia. One died of internal bleeding from a minor car accident. The other lived a life wrapped in medical gauze and dread. The disease drove a wedge between the queen and her husband. Alfonso reportedly blamed her for tainting the bloodline and became increasingly distant, taking on mistresses while their marriage frayed. Political pressures mounted, and in 1931 the royal family was exiled during the Second Spanish Republic. Victoria Eugenia spent the rest of her life abroad, watching from afar as Spain devoured itself in civil war and dictatorship. Now, from bloodline tragedy to masked betrayal, we step into the candlelit opera of a king's demise, where a masquerade became a murder scene. King Gustav III of Sweden was a patron of the arts and founded the Swedish Academy. He was assassinated at a masquerade ball. King Gustav III of Sweden believed in art, intellect, and powdered wigs. A true Enlightenment monarch, he reigned with dramatic flair-renovating theaters, encouraging literature, and founding the Swedish Academy, which would later go on to oversee the Nobel Prizes. He wrote plays, adored opera, and governed as if life itself were a stage production. But not everyone was applauding. His rule leaned toward autocracy, and he made enemies among the nobility. In 1792, their knives came out figuratively, then literally. The setting? A masquerade ball at the Royal Opera House in Stockholm. Gustav arrived in costume, masked, unaware that several conspirators were in the room with him. One, Jacob Johann Ankerström, approached and shot the king in the back. Gustav didn't die immediately. In true dramatic fashion, he lingered for nearly 2 weeks, holding court from his bed, forgiving enemies, and orchestrating justice even as gangrene crept through his body. His death became legend immortalized in Verdi's opera, Un ballo in maschera. Gustav's reign ended as he might have scripted it, under chandeliers, cloaked in intrigue, and sealed with a fatal aria. Next, we meet a warrior queen who defied colonizers with a sword in one hand and a full set of armor in the other. Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba, Angola, was a fierce warrior queen who resisted Portuguese colonization for decades, even cross-dressing to assert her authority. If you ever need a textbook example of unapologetic resistance, Queen Nzinga is your woman. Born into the royal family of the Ndongo Kingdom in what is now Angola, she rose not just through bloodline but through ruthless competence. When the Portuguese began their colonial advance in the 17th century armed with muskets, missionaries, and slave traders, Nzinga met them with diplomacy, steel, and guerrilla warfare. In a famous meeting with a Portuguese governor, Nzinga arrived to negotiate a peace treaty. The governor offered her no chair, clearly a power play. Unbothered, she had one of her attendants kneel, sat on his back, and stared the governor in the eye while hashing out terms. Message received. When her brother died, she took the throne and declared herself king not queen, donning male attire and even taking male concubines. This wasn't just theatrics. It was about asserting sovereign power in a patriarchal system. She led armies, forged alliances, even with the Dutch, and resisted colonization for nearly 40 years. Nzinga died in her 80s, undefeated and unconquered. Her name still echoes in Angolan statues, in schools, in streets. And next, we shift from royal resistance to royal Rain Makursa king, who didn't just rule the clouds metaphorically, but literally filed patents to make them weep. King Rama IX, Bhumibol Adulyadej, of Thailand held several patents for rain-making technology. Most kings pray for rain. King Bhumibol of Thailand patented it. Officially titled Rama IX, he ruled from 1946 to 2016 and became the world's longest reigning monarch by the time of his death. But what truly set him apart was his unorthodox portfolio. Philosopher, king, jazz musician, agriculturalist and amateur meteorologist turned innovator. In the 50s and 60s, Thailand faced devastating droughts. Farmers starved, crops withered, and the government floundered. Bhumibol, a king educated in Switzerland and fluent in scientific jargon, decided to intervene. With researchers and pilots, he developed a method for cloud seeding that manipulated atmospheric conditions to induce rainfall. In 1955, his technique worked. It was dubbed the Royal Rainmaking Project. In the decades that followed, the king received several patents for his techniques, which combined aircraft, silver iodide, and real-time weather data to coax clouds into cooperation. The technology was exported to other countries, and the Thai people began referring to him not just as king, but as Fra Chao Yu Hua, the Lord above our heads. A monarch with skyborn ambitions and science in his pocket. Next, we move from royal inventiveness to obsessive elegance into the life of an empress whose waistline mattered more than the empire she married into. Empress Sisi, Elizabeth of Austria, had a private gym in her palace and spent hours each day exercising to maintain her 19-inch waist. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known to history as Sisi, was less a sovereign and more a mirror of 19th century obsessions. Beauty, melancholy, and unattainable perfection. Married to Emperor Franz Joseph at just 16, she quickly discovered that palace life was less fairy tale and more corseted confinement. Her escape? Obsession? Sisi became consumed with her appearance. She kept her waist at a punishing 19 inches thanks to rigorous diets, tight-lacing corsets, and hours of daily exercise in her private palace gymnasium filled with wall bars, rings, and weights long before fitness became fashionable. She rode horses like a cavalryman, hiked alpine paths for hours, and refused to sit for portraits unless they flattered her vanity. But this wasn't just narcissism. It was rebellion against the rigid Viennese court, against her mother-in law's control, against the suffocating expectations of empire. Her health routines were her armor. Emotionally distant and politically disengaged, Sisi spent much of her life abroad, chasing peace she never found. In 1898, she was assassinated in Geneva by an anarchist who didn't even know her personally. He just wanted to kill royalty. From beauty cults to stammered speeches next, we meet the reluctant king who found his voice in the darkest hour of a nation. King George VI of the United Kingdom famously overcame a stammer, depicted in the film The King's Speech. King George VI never wanted the throne. He wasn't built for it. He was shy, prone to anxiety, and spoke with a severe stammer that turned every public address into an ordeal. For most of his life, he played second-son supportive, loyal, quietly enduring. But history has a way of plucking the reluctant and throwing them center stage. When his older brother, Edward VIII, abdicated in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American, George was thrust into the crown like a man dropped into ice water. Suddenly, a quiet duke became king of a fragile empire on the brink of war. He had to speak clearly, confidently, and constantly. With the help of speech therapist Lionel Logue, George VI tackled his stammer through unorthodox exercises and sheer determination. Their relationship, dramatized in the King's Speech, became legendary. But this wasn't just a story of personal triumph, it was a necessity of state. When World War II erupted, the King's voice became a symbol of unity, his steady broadcasts a balm to a bombed-out nation. He redefined courage no as fearlessness, but as doing what's needed while trembling. Next, from vocal battles to botanical passions, we enter the quiet world of a queen who grew an empire from the soil up. Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, wife of George III, was a keen botanist and founded Kew Gardens. Amid the powdered wigs and formal portraits, Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz stood out for her love of the natural world. Married to King George III, she is often remembered in passing as a supportive consort, the mother of 15 children, or the quiet presence behind a famously mad king. But Charlotte was much more than a footnote in royal history. She was a pioneer in petals. Botany wasn't just a hobby, it was her passion. She cultivated rare plants, studied them, and turned her royal residences into miniature Eden projects. Most notably, she played a crucial role in the development of Kew Gardens, transforming it from a modest royal estate into a renowned botanical institution. Her influence helped gather specimens from across the empire, flowers, shrubs, and trees that told colonial stories in chlorophyll. She also championed women's education and the arts, corresponding with thinkers and musicians, including Johann Christian Bach. And yes, for the curious, there's credible academic speculation that Charlotte may have had African ancestry through a 15th century Portuguese noblewoman, making her potentially the first biracial queen of Britain. Next, from peaceful gardens to paranoid grandeur, we shift to a king who built, rebuilt, and terrorized Judea one fortress at a time. King Herod the Great of Judea was a prolific builder, responsible for the reconstruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem and the fortress of Masada. Herod the Great, part ruler, part architect, part cautionary tale, was a man who seemed to believe that if you build big enough, the guilt might not catch you. Appointed king of Judea by the Romans around 37 BCE, Herod reigned with a peculiar blend of paranoia and concrete genius. His reign was soaked in blood and limestone. On one hand, he was a visionary builder. He reconstructed the Second Temple in Jerusalem, turning it into one of the ancient world's most awe-inspiring religious structures. He engineered the port city of Caesarea with advanced Roman technology, and he carved the fortress of Masada into the side of a desert plateau, a last redoubt that would later become a symbol of Jewish resistance. On the other hand, he was deeply insecure. Half Jewish, tied to Roman interests, and constantly threatened by internal plots, Herod responded with preemptive brutality. He executed his wife, his sons, and countless others in his court out of sheer suspicion. Even the Gospel of Matthew portrays him as the genocidal villain behind the massacre of the innocents. Herod ruled by terror, built by brilliance, and died hated and alone. Next, we move from blood-soaked palaces to velvet-lined jewel cases into the world of a queen who turned collecting into royal conquest. Queen Mary of Teck, wife of George V, was a passionate collector of objets, d'art, and jewelry, often acquiring items from bankrupt European nobility. Queen Mary of Teck had the bearing of a museum curator and the eye of a seasoned auctioneer. She was not born into immense wealth, but married into it with strategic grace, eventually becoming queen consort to King George V. Her public image was austere and dignified, but behind closed doors, she was utterly captivated by beautiful things. More specifically, beautiful things that used to belong to someone else. As European aristocracy collapsed in the wake of war, revolution, and bankruptcy, Queen Mary saw an opportunity. She acquired tapestries, silverware, snuff boxes, and entire furniture sets from cash-strapped nobles, often with a disarming blend of politeness and inevitability. There's an old joke at court. If Queen Mary admired it, you might as well gift-wrap it. One of her more infamous habits was dropping subtle hints during visits complimenting an item just long enough to imply it belonged in a royal collection. Owners, intimidated or honored, usually surrendered the piece. Her jewelry collection rivaled monarchies. Many of her acquisitions still gleam at coronations today. Now, from velvet gloves to language gaps we descend into the awkward court of a king who barely spoke the tongue of the realm he ruled. King George I of Great Britain spoke very little English, being a German prince, and communicated with his ministers primarily in Latin. Imagine becoming king of a country where you can't even order tea in the local language. That was George I in 1714. When Queen Anne died without a surviving heir, the British crown passed to the nearest Protestant relative, a distant German cousin named George Ludwig of Hanover. There was just one tiny complication. He barely spoke English. George I relied on Latin and French to communicate with his ministers. turning cabinet meetings into linguistic obstacle courses. His thick accent and awkward silences didn't endear him to the public, who saw him as a foreign interloper with little interest in British culture. He spent more time in Hanover than in London, earning him the nickname the King Who Wasn't There. But his reign had unexpected side effects. Unable or unwilling to micromanage, George left more power in the hands of Parliament, accelerating the shift toward constitutional monarchy. In his absence, figures like Robert Walpole, often considered Britain's first prime minister, gained real political influence. George, I might have mumbled through the national anthem, but he accidentally helped invent modern British governance. And next, we meet a queen whose marriage defied every rule of courtly decorum commoner, one king, and a scandal that changed royal matchmaking forever. Queen Elizabeth Woodville of England, wife of Edward IV, was the first commoner to marry an English king, causing much controversy. In a world where marriage was diplomacy and queens were usually born, not made, Elizabeth Woodville was an earthquake. A widow with 2 sons and no royal blood, she wasn't even considered a contender. But when Edward IV of England met her in 1464, either under a tree, on a hunting trail, or during a private plea for her late husband's estate, married her in secret. It wasn't just a scandal. It was treasonous to protocol. Elizabeth's elevation to queen consort caused immediate friction in court. Her large Woodville family was suddenly showered with titles, lands, and arranged marriages, enraging Edward's noble allies and triggering political backlash. Even Richard Neville, the powerful Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, turned against Edward in part due to the marriage. Yet Elizabeth proved politically astute and fiercely protective of her family. She navigated the bloody currents of the Wars of the Roses, twice seeking sanctuary in Westminster Abbey, once while heavily pregnant. After Edward's death, her world collapsed again. Her sons, Edward V and his brother Richard, vanished into the Tower of London, presumed murdered, possibly by Richard III. From defiant bride to grieving mother, Elizabeth's story was a royal gambling history rolled the hard dice. Next, we move from political marriage to political theory into the mind of a king who wrote books about witches, kingship, and why monarchs answer only to God. King James I of England, James VI of Scotland, was a keen intellectual and author, writing works on witchcraft and the divine right of kings. King James I of England, also known as James VI of Scotland, wasn't your average monarch content to wave from a balcony and sign decrees. No, James fancied himself a philosopher king. He didn't just rule kingdoms. He published books, essays, theological treatises, even political manifestos. If Twitter had existed in the 17th century, James would have live-tweeted the Gunpowder Plot in Latin. Among his most infamous works was Daemonology, a dense and deadly serious defense of witch hunting. Published in 1597, it argued that witches were not only real, but actively conspiring with the devil to undermine God's divine order. The book helped legitimize some of the most brutal witch trials in Scotland's history and contributed to a cultural paranoia that stretched across borders. But James was just as passionate about royalty as he was about sorcery. He advocated for the divine right of kings, the belief that monarchs were chosen by God and therefore answered to no one else. His views often clashed with Parliament, setting the ideological groundwork for the English Civil War decades later. A king who loved power, feared witches, and worshipped words. Now, from high-minded theory to horticultural delight, we meet a queen whose green thumbs left their mark on royal gardens and English landscape history. Queen Mary II of England, co-monarch with her husband William III, was known for her love of gardening and the establishment of Hampton Court Palace Gardens. If Queen Mary II had not co-ruled an empire, she could have easily ruled over a botanical wonderland. While political historians remember her as half of the Protestant power couple that unseated James II in the Glorious Revolution, Mary had a more grounded passion literally. She loved gardens, and under her green-fingered guidance, Hampton Court Palace bloomed into one of the most exquisite gardens in Europe. Inspired by Dutch horticulture, not surprising given her Dutch husband, Mary imported rare tulips, exotic bulbs, and intricate garden designs. She worked with famed gardeners like George London and Henry Wise to lay out symmetrical parterres, winding alleys, and blooming orangeries. The gardens weren't just pretty, they were statements of power, refinement, and taste. Mary's love of nature offered a counterpoint to the political turbulence of her time. Despite being childless and ruling in a tense joint monarchy, she found solace among the hedges. Her personal letters often reference plants, weather patterns, and seasonal planting cycles. After her death from smallpox at just 32, William continued her gardening legacy in grief. A queen remembered not for her airs or wars, but for the way she made the land bloom. Next, from florals to frescoes, visit a king who turned his court into an art gallery and made one painter more powerful than most politicians. King Philip IV of Spain was a great patron of the arts, especially of Velázquez, and accumulated a vast collection of paintings. King Philip IV of Spain may not have been the most effective ruler, but he knew how to curate a good gallery. Reigning from 1621 to 1665, he presided over the slow decline of Spain's global empire and compensated for the political stagnation by investing heavily in art. His court was more museum than monarchy, and its star curator, Diego Velázquez. Velázquez wasn't just court painter, he was confidant, diplomat, and mirror to Philip's reign. His masterpiece, Las Meninas, a puzzle of perspectives, power, and presence features the king himself, reflected in a distant mirror, watching his daughter and her entourage. It's arguably the most meta-royal portrait in history. Philip sponsored thousands of works, many of which still hang in the Prado Museum in Madrid. He transformed the Buen Retiro Palace into a showcase for painters like Rubens, Titian, and El Greco. Art became propaganda, legacy, and therapy for a king overseeing an empire in slow-motion collapse. Where armies failed, canvases endured. Next, from brushstrokes to birth rates, we step into the life of a woman who ruled a vast empire, reformed nations, and gave birth to 16 children. Queen Maria Theresa of Austria was the only female ruler of the Habsburg monarchy and reformed the military and education systems, bearing 16 children. Maria Theresa didn't have time for doubt. She ruled an empire, birthed a dynasty, and still managed to find the energy to reform everything from tax codes to textbooks. As the only female ruler of the Habsburg monarchy and technically never crowned, Emperor She had to fight harder, speak louder, and reform faster than her male counterparts just to stay on the throne. When her father, Charles VI, died in 1740, she inherited a shaky empire and the dubious privilege of proving a woman could rule in a man's world. She immediately had to contend with the War of the Austrian Succession, during which Frederick the Great snatched Silesia and Europe's powers lined up to test her resolve. Spoiler, they underestimated her. Beyond military defense, she modernized the army, centralized administration, reformed the tax system, and overhauled education. She championed Enlightenment values, though not too much, since she remained staunchly Catholic. Her policies laid the groundwork for the later reign of her son, Joseph II, even if the two clashed frequently. Oh, and while reshaping a continent, she gave birth to 16 children, including the ill-fated Marie Antoinette, Talk about multitasking. And now, we leave the court for the cockpit where a king lived a double life, flying commercial airliners incognito for over 2 decades. King Willem-Alexander of the Netherlands secretly worked as a co-pilot for KLM Royal Dutch Airlines for 21 years, flying 2 short-haul flights a month. Forget the palace gates and royal ceremonies, King Willem-Alexander was more comfortable in a cockpit. Before he took the throne in 2013, and even after, he quietly worked as a commercial airline co-pilot for KLM. For 21 years, he flew regional jets, chatting with crew, doing pre-flight checks, and occasionally surprising passengers when he made in-flight announcements over the intercom. The Dutch king trained as a pilot in his youth and maintained his license rigorously. But here's the twist. He never told passengers who he was, using the pseudonym Wa van Buren, a nod to his family's lesser-known noble title. He remained anonymous, just another voice crackling over the speaker. Most travelers had no idea their co-pilot was royalty. Why did he do it? For the love of flying, he said. It relaxed him, grounded him ironic, perhaps for a man who had to wave from balconies and walk red carpets. It also fits with Dutch royal style, modest, functional, and allergic to excessive pomp. Kings, it turns out, don't always wear crowns. Sometimes they wear headsets and navigate cloud banks. And with that, we've landed our final fact. 99 royal oddities, absurdities, and ironies because monarchies may age, but their mysteries never seem to retire.